All right, should we get started? Everybody want to grab a seat? There's some beverages in the back. You can help yourself to. Thanks for coming out on a beautiful Friday night. There's a lot of things you could be doing tonight, but we're here to talk about our neighborhoods. Great topic, so thanks for making time. My name is Mayor Paulton Haken. I serve as the 32nd mayor of Sioux Falls. 5 years into this gig, and love doing it every day. Love serving the people of this community. Have a blast working with people like you who are passionate about our city, passionate about neighborhoods. I think one of the things that I have always appreciated about our neighborhoods in Sioux Falls, and specifically a lot of our core neighborhoods, is just their passion, their determination, their drive to make their individual neighborhoods better. You don't see the level of passion about neighborhoods, quite honestly, out in the burbs that you do in the core. And that's a big reason why we've seen just a lot of the preservation, a lot of the progress that we've seen in the core of our city is because we have some very strong neighborhood associations. So Sioux Falls is growing very quickly. We grew by about 6,300 people last year, almost 7,000 the year before. So that's about a Mitchell in 2.5 years that we've grown. And with that growth comes a lot of exciting things, a lot of exciting developments. Also brings tensions with development that needs to occur and happen to support that growth. And sometimes those tensions aren't always in alignment with our neighborhoods. We have a housing shortage. We need more housing. Sometimes neighborhoods want to preserve single family. And sometimes the development community says, we want to turn this into multifamily. And how do we create those situations where both can succeed while still honoring and respecting our core neighborhoods? We've seen it as our downtown continues to move east. Our downtown is pretty developed to Minnesota Avenue, but downtown is moving east. We now are talking about the riverbank and the Riverline development. And I think we're going to continue to see our downtown moving east. Well, that's ultimately going to create some collisions that are going to continue to happen. And so figuring out how differing socioeconomic groups can coexist in neighborhoods, differing sometimes agendas, and that word sometimes has a negative connotation. It doesn't have to be. Different agendas can coexist in a neighborhood. Those things are very important. I always encourage our neighborhood leaders, our neighborhood association folks to make sure you stay in close contact with our city council. I see a couple of them are here today. They're very strong advocates for what's happening in our neighborhoods. We end up talking about and dealing with a lot of opportunities, challenges at our city council meetings, oftentimes around rezoning, right, Greg? We do any of those? And they're not always 8-0 votes. And so I think what makes those sometimes contentious situations, though still successful, is that we try and listen and we try to work through issues and try to do what's best for the community as a whole. Leadership, however, and speaking to my council colleagues and myself, I always tell people leadership is disappointing people at a rate they can accept. And sometimes that's what it feels like. We kind of get put in some tough situations as leaders on how we continue to develop and grow our community. And sometimes there's difficult situations and we just have to make calls. But I want you to know that for me personally, I really appreciate the vocal advocates in places like All Saints neighborhood and Katrina, and Lura in the Cathedral District, and some of those voices that are very strong in those neighborhoods, because we need those people to stand up and to let us know what we can do better as a city, but also what the neighborhood can be doing better in response to what our needs are. And I often challenge our neighbors and our people in our community to ask not what your city can do for you, but what can your neighborhood do for the city? You know, what are the needs that you have? Bring them to us, but how can you help us accomplish those? Because at the end of the day, communities, we are 99% alike in what we want. We want good streets. We want walkable neighborhoods. We want them to be well lit. We want them to be safe. We want good schools in them. We want good traffic flow. We want clean air. We want LED lights that are energy efficient. We want a lot of the same things. Sometimes we differ in how we should get there, but we do all want the same things. And so thank you. Thank you for your advocacy. Thank you for your work. I wish I could stay tonight. I have another event I have to be at 6 o'clock. So I'm going to be leaving after I introduce our friend Jim Diers, who Jim is back in Sioux Falls. It was about 10 years ago that Jim was here last. Jim is a real get for Sioux Falls to have here. He speaks with communities all over the world, and I just found out you've even done some work in my home country of the Netherlands. Is that right?
Yeah.
I lived in Holland for 3 or 4 months in college, and the way that they traverse their neighborhoods, the way the neighborhoods are designed, how public transit works, how everybody bikes year-round. My host father, when I lived in Amsterdam, he was 62 years old. He'd never owned a vehicle in his life. He biked to Schiphol Airport, where he worked every single day. He had these plastic bags he put around his legs so his patent leather shoes wouldn't get dirty. It was hard for me to get my head around that someone could live like that. But he did. And I think hopefully we can do some of that more bikeable, walkable community stuff here in Sioux Falls. So I'd like you to welcome Jim. We're lucky to have him. He's going to talk a lot about his work that he's done around the country and around the world, but also bring some of those ideas and concepts around neighborhood and community building to Sioux Falls, and what can we do on a local level to work closely with city government to build stronger, safer, better neighborhoods. So please help me welcome Jim Diers.
Oh, thanks, Mayor, and thanks all of you for coming. It was such a pleasure to be back in Sioux Falls. It's been too long. I arrived late last night, and I'd been flying all day, so I was really hungry. I was hoping I could find a place with a beer and a burger, and I found like 20 of them. I was downtown. It's just incredible. And, the weather was spectacular. Everybody was out in the patios, and just everybody was mellow. It was happy. It was great. Love what's happening downtown. All the people living downtown, all the small independent businesses that are downtown. The sculpture walk, had a great time. But Diane is the best tour guide. She took me this morning out to all the neighborhoods, or a lot of the neighborhoods. And it was so impressive to see those neighborhoods. 5 residential historic neighborhoods, and just the way people keeping up those homes and keeping up the heritage and that identity that creates when you have that that housing like that. Other neighborhoods that had the neighborhood identification signs up. The other neighborhood was it Brian Lindeman's planting all these trees all over the place. Amazing. Hearing stories from the pandemic from All Saints about front porch concerts. Just incredible community activity. Love it. So what I want to do today is really talk about how do we get more of that, right? How do we get more people? This is really phenomenal to turn out tonight, but how do we get the whole city involved in this neighborhood movement? So that's really what I want to get to, because I'm passionate about community. I want to share a friend of mine who's also shares my passion for community. This is Peter Kenyon. Peter has an organization called the Bank of Ideas. He will operate out of an old bank in Perth, in Australia. And he does work all over the world in community building. Absolutely passionate about it. Here's a picture of him visiting me in Seattle. And then when I visited him a lot in Perth. And the other thing Peter's passionate about besides community is Aussie rules football. So he took me to a game. And he tried to explain to me how it worked. And he said, basically, Aussie rules football is a game in which 60,000 people who badly need exercise sit and watch 36 athletes who don't. And I tell you this story because I think we need to realize that community can't be a spectator sport. And that too many people are out there just watching you do all the good work. And how do we get everybody engaged? So that's really what we're going to get to tomorrow. Sort of what are those tools? What are some of the basic principles for getting people engaged in community? But tonight I really want to reinforce why community is so important. That there's absolutely no substitute for community when it comes to the things we care most deeply about. You can't substitute local government. You can't substitute nonprofit organizations. The things that we care most deeply about are best done by community. Absolutely passionate about it. So in that spirit, recognizing community needs to be a participatory sport, I want to get you engaged, okay? So I'd like to divide the room into two, and it's a little hard because these tables are right in the middle, so just decide which side of the room you're on, okay? Okay? So we're going to start with this side. See how much community there is here, okay? So, give me an N. N. That's pretty good. Give me an E. E. Yeah. Give me an I. I. Give me a G. G. Give me an H. H. Give me a B. B. Give me an O. O. Give me an R. R. What's that spell? Neighbor. Yeah, louder. Neighbor. Yeah. Okay, this side. Give me a P. P. Give me an O. O. Oh, you guys are good. W. W. E. E. R. R. What's that spell? Power. Let's hear it again. Power. Yeah, so let's put it together. Neighbor. Power. Neighbor. Power. Oh, yeah, you got it. Thank you. That's good. I'm going to be the horse by tomorrow noon. So, there. So I think there's two tools for meeting people's needs. I just did a workshop for city leaders before this and acknowledged that there's a real role for local government. There's some things communities don't do so well, right? Like you need police to enforce laws, right? You don't want neighbors doing that. But there's also a role for communities. So two different tools. Agencies, I think, are organizations that are dependent on paid employees. So it's things like business, government, education, healthcare. But community is a group of people who freely identify with and support one another. And I'm trying to clarify the terms because sometimes we use the words community and neighborhood interchangeably. And I think they're very different. There's a relationship between the two, but they're different. Community is about our social relationships, a group of people who freely identify with and support one another. And they operate in very different ways, agencies and communities. So agencies provide services, whereas communities provide care. Agencies, we have different classes of people. We have the professionals, the volunteers, and the clients. In community, we're all citizens in the largest sense of the word. Agencies tend to be top-down, whereas communities are democratic. Agencies tend to focus on needs, whereas communities tend to focus on people's gifts. Agencies tend to be one way, whereas communities are all about reciprocity and mutual support. Agencies tend to be siloed, whereas communities, everything comes together. You get a more holistic perspective. Agencies are totally dependent on money. Communities are totally dependent on trust and relationships. And I'm not valuing one over the other. Both are absolutely critical. But what I want to talk about is neighbor. Yeah! And about why this work is so absolutely important. I think there's nothing more important right now in our society than the work you're doing. And I mean that honestly. We got huge problems we're facing, and you're the solution. So I want to go through it. One is the power to overcome loneliness. Just read this book, The Lonely Century, where studies have shown that 3 in 5 adults in the United States identify as lonely. There was work done out of Brigham Young University research that showed that loneliness is worse for our health than not exercising, as harmful as being an alcoholic, and twice as harmful as being obese. Statistically, loneliness is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Huge health consequences. In the UK, they identified 9 million people as being lonely. It's so bad that they have created a minister for loneliness, as if another bureaucrat could take care of the problem. And of course, this is only the community can address this. I was in Newcastle in New South Wales in Australia, meeting with the neighborhood group, and they showed me this project. They said they had this land that was owned by the city, kind of a boulevard, but it was just grass, and it really wasn't good for anything. And a couple of the neighbors got interested, and they said, why don't we revegetate this with native plants? And let's create a picnic table so we have a place to gather and start having community gatherings. So they put that in. And they had events, neighborhood events there. And just a year later, you see how the kangaroo paws are growing and native plants are growing. Really cool environmental project. And I looked up in the tree, and it had tawny frogmouths, the weirdest looking birds I've ever seen, were sitting there right in the center of Newcastle, right in the center of the city, because they'd brought in these native plants. But the coolest thing was this guy in the center is the one who led the tour. He's the leader of this project. And he told me a story. He's a Vietnam War veteran. He was totally depressed, living in his house behind closed doors, not connected to anybody, totally lonely. And one of the neighbors knocked on the door and said, we're doing this project across the street. We need you. Can you help us? He is now the leader on this project. And the love that they have for each other, the respect that they have for this man, the meaning he now has in his life. Only communities can provide that. So what do they have in Newcastle?
Neighbor.
Yeah! Yeah! It's power to promote health. My colleague John McKnight, who started the Asset-Based Community Development Institute, wrote a book with Peter Block called The Abundant Community, and there they say our neighborhoods are the primary source of our health. How long we live, how often we are sick are determined by our personal behaviors, our social relationships, our physical environment, and our income. We are the people who can change these things individually and with our neighbors. Medical systems and doctors cannot. I've seen studies that show that only about 20% of health outcomes can actually be attributed to healthcare professionals. And thank God we have healthcare professionals. I mean, if you need surgery, you probably don't want to go to your neighbor, right? Unless your neighbor's a surgeon. But in terms of promoting health, community has a huge role to play in that. Story from the Netherlands. I wish the mayor was here. I have lots of stories from the Netherlands. I should also share stories with the city about all the amazing things local government's doing to support neighborhoods. But in Amsterdam, I was in the senior housing complex, and they were trying to figure out how do we get other seniors engaged. And they had a common area in the center that people just walked through. So some of the seniors got together and said, why don't we start serving tea here and invite the other seniors to sit down with us and start brainstorming about what we can do to make our place better. What are our dreams for our community? So they put a giving tree up where they could put their dreams and then sort of what they could contribute to realizing those dreams. One of their biggest dreams was, we want to get a fitness set. We want a treadmill so we can work out a little bit and get in shape because our health is really deteriorating. They talked to the manager of the senior complex and they said, we can't do that because of health and safety regulations. We can't get people healthy because of health and safety regulations. But people might fall off the treadmill or, So they're trying to figure out, how do we deal with this? And one of the members did a walking tour around the neighborhood and realized there was a boxing club just down the block. So she went and knocked on the door of the boxing club, and the guy who owns it is a 2-time world champion boxer. That's him on the left, just in case you can't tell us apart. And they said, and they looked around, and he had all this fitness equipment. And they said, can we use some of that? And he says, yeah, it's only used before work and after work right now. During the day, nobody's here. You can come in during the day and use it. They were so excited. And so I joined them, and they were walking across the parking lot. They had their walkers just going, so slow, but they all had huge smiles on their face and watching them work out on this equipment and supporting each other. And they were telling me stories like this woman. She said, I have to go to the doctor every week. The last time I saw him, he said, come back in 6 months. But just the power of community to take care of one another, to take care of our health. Power to prevent crime. So glad that the police chief and others from the department could join us this afternoon for the workshop. They're doing some awesome work in terms of supporting the Neighborhood Watch program. But the power to prevent crime. You know, police can enforce laws, but communities are in the best position to prevent crime. People are much less likely to violate community when they are part of community, right? John McKnight again says there are two major determinants of our local safety. One is how many neighbors we know by name. The other is how often we are present and associated in public, outside our houses. Police activity is a minor protection compared to these two community actions. We spend way too many resources lining up the ambulances at the bottom of the cliff when community's job is to build the fence at the top and to support each other, to help people from falling through the cracks. It's the Fremont neighborhood of Seattle where we had a huge problem with drug dealing underneath the bridge. Had to call the police all the time. When the police come out, the drug dealers would leave, but as soon as the police left, the drug dealers would be back. Finally, the solution was we're going to put a fence around this so we don't have the problem. The community said, well, that's a terrible idea. They said, we have a better solution. We'll build a troll. This troll is so big, that's a real VW it's got in his claw there. Sort of an environmental statement, like you lifted it off the top of the bridge. Now it brings tourists from all over the world. And when they come, they shop in the local business district. There's always activity, legitimate activity underneath the bridge, so there's absolutely no problems with public safety. Power to respond to natural disasters. I tell you, everywhere I go right now, there's been a natural disaster. I hope it's not just me. But increasing number of forest fires and floods, hurricanes, tornadoes. Everywhere I go, drought. People are experiencing it. Our sister city of Seattle is Christchurch in New Zealand. I was there just before the earthquake, there just after the earthquake. The mayor of Christchurch, Leanne Dalzell, told me, the best thing you can do to prepare for emergencies is get to know your neighbors. She said when that earthquake came in New Zealand, in Christchurch, there weren't enough emergency crews to get out to all the neighborhoods. Much of the infrastructure was toast. They couldn't even get through. The streets were gone. People were totally dependent on their neighbors. And I've heard this story over and over and over again. I got invited to Lismore in Australia that had a huge problem with the whole city flooded in 2017. So I did a workshop on recovery from the flood. Became friends with Eddie Lloyd here on the right-hand side, who was on the city council. We became Facebook friends. Last year, 5 years after my visit, I was looking at my Facebook posts, and this popped up. You might not be able to read it from where you're at. It says, the rain just won't stop. We have not had a break in rain for hours and hours. My brain can't fathom the gravity of tragedy from this flood. All our animals are dead. My heart is breaking for Lismore. We are 15 meters up in the loft, but only 1 meter left until the water reaches us. I called the state emergency service, so we will wait, but we have our canoes if we need to get away. I was devastated, but didn't know what I could do from Seattle. State emergency service never showed up, but her neighbor was there with a boat. And her neighbor rescued over 100 families that day. But if they hadn't been a tight community, if they hadn't been connected, they wouldn't have known who was missing, who needed help. So what do they have in Lismore? Yeah! The next one is the power to care for the earth. I really, some of it's related to the natural disasters we're facing, but increasingly concerned about climate change. And I think communities, again, have a huge role to play. It's like if I'm just disconnected from community, what difference does it make if I don't act responsibly? I'm just one person. Or what action can I take? I'm just one person. I can't make a difference. But it's in community that we feel some connection with one another, some responsibility to one another, some accountability, and some sense that collectively our actions can make change. So I just want to share a story from our Ballard neighborhood. Ballard is the neighborhood of Seattle with the least number of street trees and the least number of parks of any neighborhood in Seattle. But there was a woman there named Drvilla Gowan who cared passionately about trees. She wanted to see trees up and down the streets. So she put notices in her church bulletin. She put them in the Ballard News Tribune, advertising for other people who shared her passion for street trees. And she tried to find somebody on every block in Ballard who cared passionately about trees. And if nobody came forward, she'd go to that block and she would knock on every door until she convinced somebody they shared her passion for street trees. Is there an echo from the, can we turn down the volume a little bit? Seems like it's, are you hearing it? Just me. Okay, just me. Don't worry. So she got the block captain to take a training about how to plant and take care of the trees and recruit the neighbors to do the same thing. And then they all signed pledge forms saying, we'll get involved in this project. She turned in her pledge forms with a matching fund application, much like the neighborhood grants you have here. And one day, trucks pulled into her neighborhood with one, I call Drvilla Gowan the Brian Lindemann of Seattle. Yeah. Brian's the one who's been planting all the trees here. So one day, trucks pulled into her neighborhood with 1,000 eggy trees, dropped them off at every block in Ballard. Drvilla knocked on the door of the block captain and said, the trees are here. And that day, over 1,000 people got involved in planting trees up and down the streets of Ballard. Beginning of the day, there's no street trees. The end of the day, they had tree-lined streets. Look what we can do when we work together as a community. So then they felt some power. They recognized there was an abandoned lot where there was a lot of drug dealing, a lot of problems going down. So they decided to turn that into a park, Baker Park. Here's the entranceway into the park. They landscaped it with native plants. They got one of the neighbors who was Native American to build a totem. And the totem has a bear with a frog in his mouth, kind of a symbol of returning nature to the city. Then they worked with the local school and said, you got all this asphalt around the school. You get all this runoff that's creating problems. The water goes into the storm sewer, which goes into the stream and affects the salmon. So they got the school district to agree to tear out all of the asphalt and put in grass and green it. So it was called a Graded Green Project. And now we do it around all our schools. But that idea came from the community. This was a piece of property owned by our transportation department, but never developed because it's too steep. It's a street between two blocks, but cars could never make it to the top. The only thing that tried to go up were four-wheel drive vehicles. They come in the middle of the night, race their engines, challenge each other to try to make it to the top, drive the neighbors totally crazy. Well, I thought the neighbors were crazy because they had this idea, and they went out, and by hand, they terraced this hard-pan clay soil, put these timbers in, and turned that problem property into a community garden. So that place that kept the neighbors apart is now the place that brings them together. This is now one of 120 community gardens we have in Seattle, all built by neighbors involving 10,000 gardeners. This woman was passionate about salmon, and at the Carkeek Park, she wanted to see salmon return. So she went out and educated neighbors about reforesting around native plants, taking out the invasive plants. So they did lots of work parties. They educated neighbors about doing the same in their yards, about not using pesticides, about not using fertilizers. They created salmon weirs. They planted salmon fry. And they were successful in bringing salmon back to the park. It's been phenomenal. And every year they celebrate the return of the salmon because they've all played a role in it. They said, well, now we got salmon back. We want to get kids back into our park. We need to build a playground. So they had a design meeting, and one of the kids raised his hand and said, I want a salmon playground. Well, nobody had ever seen a salmon playground before, but a local artist had an idea, and he built a 19-foot-long salmon. It's so big, you slide in the mouth, and you come out the tail. And you climb into caves, gives kids a sense of the struggle that salmon go through to get back to the city of Seattle. Here's where you go in. Here's where you come out. Here's a dedication for another project where they showcased that over 20 years they built more than 20 parks, all with volunteers in one neighborhood. They said, well, this is great. We've made our neighborhood a much better place, but we're concerned about what's happening to the planet. We're concerned about climate change. So they organized an Earth Fair every summer in the Key Park, right in the center of their neighborhood. And they have all kinds of booths to educate neighbors about what they can do to reduce their carbon footprint. But the first booth you go to is the undriver's license station, where you go and you check all the ways you will not drive over the next month. And when you do, you get a laminated undriver's license. You're just like my official Washington State driver's license. So Julia Field organized this. She says, I'm going to walk, I'm going to bike, I'm going to take transit, train, et cetera, et cetera. And when you get your undriver's license, it entitles you to drive the shuttle bus. And this is a foot-powered mobile that's going up and down the streets of Ballard. It gets everybody's attention, gets people thinking, what can I do to get out of my car? What can I do to reduce my carbon footprint? This created a movement. Now there are over 100 neighborhood sustainability groups all over Puget Sound. And it all started with Dervilla Gowan and those street trees. We often wonder, what difference am I making in my neighborhood? But it can grow. We share those stories. And the action grows and grows and grows. There is incredible untapped potential in our neighborhoods. What do they have in Ballard? Yeah! Yeah! The power to create great places, right? How do we create a place where we can really be proud? How do we make our neighborhood a place with which we identify positively? So many times our neighborhoods, particularly lower income neighborhoods, are defined by people outside of our neighborhood. They're defined by the media that give them really bad names. We need to take back the power and say, what are we proud of in our community? What's our vision for our neighborhood? And build around that. So this is in the Newton neighborhood of Surrey, British Columbia. Right in the heart of their downtown, they had these gigantic trees. They said, this is pretty cool. But they had a huge public safety problem there. Because it was dark in those trees, there was lots of drug dealing going on. There was homeless encampments. People were afraid to go anywhere near these trees. They called in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who are their local police, and they said, what can we do about this? And they did a CPTED, crime prevention through environmental design analysis. And they said, what we need to do is chop down all the trees so we have better sight lines. The community said, don't you dare. We're going to, rather than try to drive people out of this, we're going to try to bring people in. That is the secret for building community. It's not, and dealing with crime isn't always how do we close places off, then we have less and less communities. How do we bring people in? So they came up with a great solution. They gave this place a name. They call it the Grove. And they had an opening. They said true community safety is only possible when neighbors know each other. So they put up a welcome to the Grove sign on opening day. They put up signs saying welcome in all the languages of that very diverse neighborhood. They put up, they asked the city, could you put in lighting at night so people feel safer? And the city did a study and said it's going to cost us $25,000 to do it. We can't afford it. One of the neighbors said, well, I got some Christmas lights. They put it up for very little money, and it's really been effective. They figured out ingenious ways to use the trees. So this is a tree that was cut down a long time ago, and on the stump they created a chessboard. They created a tightrope between the trees. They created a village in the trees. The library had a bunch of encyclopedias that were out of date, so they built Encyclopedia House out of those. Had a hard time getting that through the building code. They do lots of workshops there. This is a seed bombing workshop, teaching people how to do seed bombing. They have bowlers to keep cars from coming through, and they're always dressing them up. There's just lots of artists in the neighborhood. They have a little free piano, lots of musicians in the neighborhood, so they're always coming in doing concerts, but just ways to activate the space to bring in community. They created the poetry, where they rearrange words on the trunk of the tree to create poems. And here's one of the poems that came out of the Grove, and they framed those around the tree. And they created a group called the Cedar Barks Poets Gathering, and they've written many volumes of poetry now. Here's one of the formerly homeless residents of the Grove, who's the leader in this poetry project. And they have all kinds of community gatherings. They had a blessing ceremony when it opened up with First Nations doing the smudging. They celebrate Memorial Day. Every major holiday, including Groundhog's Day. This is the old park sign. No dumping, no littering allowed. Clothes dusted on. They put up their own sign. Park suggestions. Don't be mean. Smile at others. Say hello. This is community. This is the place everybody complained about. So what do they have in Surrey?
Neighbors.
Yeah! Yeah! The power to revitalize neighborhoods. So last year, my wife and I were driving around Utah. We wanted to go to some of those great rock formations, and we're doing some birding. So we were in Moab, and we were headed from Moab to Salt Lake City. It was early morning. I was really tired. So when I saw a sign along the highway that said "Good Coffee," I pulled off. I took the exit, and I ended up in this town called Helper. Beautiful old historic buildings. And I found the coffee place. But better than and the coffee was great. But better than the coffee was this woman's story. She told me the story of Helper. And she said Helper was founded when the railroad track came through Helper, and it became a major terminal for both passenger and freight traffic. And because it became a major terminal, major rail line, they started developing coal camps in the late 1800s all around Helper. There were 32 coal camps where they're doing coal mining. But in the 1970s, with the decline of the coal industry, these coal camps were shutting down. And so they lost just about all but 3 of the coal camps. Then the railroad terminal closed because there was nothing to haul. And so they were in desperate shape. They called themselves the living ghost town. So people were still there, but there was no economic activity. Nothing was going on. By the way, the town is named Helper because this is called a Helper engine, and it's the engine that they add in Helper in order to help the train get over the mountain. You know the little engine that could? Remember that story? Yeah, this is it. I think I can. But that was sort of the attitude of the whole town. Instead of focusing on what they were missing and focusing on their misfortune, they tried to think about what do we have and how can we build on that? Which I think is a good lesson for all of us. And what they realized was we have a great history. We have an incredible story to tell about mining and about the railroads. So they put up a large 20-foot-high miner at the entrance to their town to celebrate what they had. This is their old city hall. And in the city hall, one of the rooms, they started to create a railroad and mining museum. And it started bringing some visitors. They quickly outgrew that space, so they renovated this old hotel to become a museum. And now it brings people from all over the world. It's a phenomenal museum. It recreates what it's like to go through a mine. It shows what happened in the old mining camps. It has a lot of the things from the old railroad. And they have an outdoor space with a lot of the equipment. But they saw their history as a real strength. The volunteers renovated the old miners' cottages, made them look great. Another strength they had was a man who grew up in this town, became a famous artist, and went to the University of Utah to teach art. And he came back to this town and realized these buildings were this was selling for $18,000 because it was abandoned. So he bought it. And he renovated it to become his studio, and then he started inviting students to come, and they could stay in some of the bedrooms. There were lots of little bedrooms because it used to be a brothel. And they could use the studio if they volunteered time to help renovate the building. It was really an ingenious idea. A lot of those students stayed, so they have artists, increasing number of artists in Helper. And so they have art galleries that are opening, brings tourists in. Some of the art they created that shows the Helper engine pulling the train over the mountain, the coal car. They recreated the brothel. And they just create events around their culture, around their arts and music and film. They took the old theater as part of the film festival now. It's great to see your old theater come back. Beautiful theater. They took this building, created a theater in this building, so they're all part of this festival. There's a river that flows just a block off of the main street. So they said, that's another asset. So the junior high kids got involved in revegetating along the creek. They created a trail system. So there's a river walk, beautiful, beautiful walk now. The artists created murals along the way. There was a grassy area in the middle of town that wasn't being utilized. The Girl Scouts came in and said, we want to create a park for our seniors. So they did this. The junior high school students renovated this old kiosk that they got from one of the mining camps. They cleaned up the laneways to make them attractive. They kept the old signs, the historic signs, created new ones. The celebrated helper. They put these yellow Adirondack chairs all through the town to make it pedestrian friendly, to attract people. All kinds of businesses started up. You know, the book Bowling Alone, how we're losing bowling alleys. And Helper, the bowling alley is vibrant. And because of all these people come in, and you can see all the activities they're advertising there. The old gas stations, they renovated those. Those are now Airbnbs. And it brings in all kinds of, and now there's just all kinds of activity in Helper. But it's because of
Neighbor.
Yeah! Don't whisper. Be proud.
Power.
Yeah, power. Yeah, good. Power to overcome prejudice and hate. That is just becoming a huge issue these days, where the divisions in politics and the way people are hating people they don't know. This guy, Khalid al-Juja, was a Syrian who had a date trees and fruit trees nursery in Syria. He fled Syria as a refugee with his family. And after several different stops, they ended up in the Lower Hutt community in Ipuni in New Zealand. The local community garden gave him space to create a nursery. Really cool. And he took cuttings, and really he and his family tended those, potted them. And after about a year, were ready to sell hundreds of plants that he'd potted. But one night, vandals came and destroyed everything. But the community rallied around him. They donated plants. They donated potting soil. And one weekend, they had planting parties. And dozens of people came out to replant these plants. Local cooks came and cooked food for the volunteers. Local musicians played to keep everybody's spirits up. And totally restored his nursery. But that's what happens when we start build more inclusive communities, bring different people together. Get to know people as individuals rather than by their stereotype, rather than by the labels we put on them. So here's what I see as the power of community. Talked about a lot of this. Overcoming loneliness, promoting health, preventing crime, responding to disaster, caring for the earth, creating great places, revitalizing neighborhoods. Didn't talk about this one yet, but sustaining the local economy, defeating hate and polarization, advancing social justice. No major social change has ever come top down. It's all come bottom up. Without strong communities, we can't make change. And strengthening democracy. Without strong communities, we don't have a democracy. People don't participate. They think of themselves as taxpayers rather than as citizens. So there's no substitute for community. Margaret Wheatley said, whatever the question, community is the answer. And that's why I say the work you're doing is the most important work that can be done right now. What I'd like you to do around your tables is just to spend a few minutes sharing your own stories about when have you seen community at its best here in Sioux Falls. I've shared stories from all over the world. You're going to say, hey, that's nice, but we're different. We're Sioux Falls. But this stuff happens absolutely everywhere. And I've heard some awesome stories from Sioux Falls. And I'd love to hear some more. So could you just spend a few minutes around your table sharing your own story about when have you seen community at its best? Was it in your neighborhood? Was it in response to a crisis? Was it in the workplace? How have you experienced community? And what's your best story? Okay? let's just spend 5-10 minutes, see how it goes. So I'd love to hear a local story. So who would be willing to share a story with the room as a whole? And Diane, I'll bring you a mic. All right, thanks. All right.
So one of the things we talked about is Mary lives in the Cathedral Historical District. And we asked Mary when we thought, I asked her, just asked her the question, like, when was Sioux Falls at its best? What was a memory? And she said it was probably when the district was started. Because that was where all the prominent people lived in that historical district.
Yeah.
And she pointed out that all the prominent people lived on the corners.
Huh.
So if you think about that neighborhood, that's where all the big houses are, on the corners. So kind of going back to when the district, she just told me too, it was the very first historic district in South Dakota. It was a cathedral neighborhood, cathedral historical district. So kind of back when it first.
But you
Yeah.
know, you have the big important houses on the corner and on the top of the hill, and Summit. Guess
Yep.
why it's called Summit?
Yep.
And on the side streets, especially once you get past Prairie on one side and Duluth on the other, there were the streets going downhill had the homes of the people who worked for them. So the guy who worked at the lumber yard lived in one of the smaller houses between Duluth and Spring.
Yeah, that's great. And a great example of sort of the diversity of people that can be in a neighborhood and how we can make connections across difference. And also about how that designation that you got when was that was designated?
1974.
74. So, almost 50 years ago. And what a difference that's made for that neighborhood that continues. So it wasn't just a story from 50 years ago. It's something that's been an ongoing gift to the neighborhood and to the community. Great story. Others? Nobody wants to top that, huh? Oh, here we go. All right.
All right. Okay. My name's Jackie. I live on the east side of Sioux Falls, and I'm getting a lot of feedback here. I don't know. There we go. I guess I'll stand. So I live on the east side of Sioux Falls, and I moved there during the pandemic. So that comes with a lot of challenges, as you can imagine, of not really getting to know your neighbors right away. And so I'm still learning a lot about my neighborhood. But last year I was on social media, flipping through Facebook, and this alert came up of a little girl in our neighborhood area that was missing. And I didn't know her, knew hardly anybody in our neighborhood, really. She came from a family of immigrants. English was not her first language. So it was just a missing person, like if you see her, call the police, that kind of a thing. And I just was like, oh gosh, what can I do? I don't know, but I just felt the need to maybe I'll go walk around the neighborhood. It was a nice evening, and maybe I'll go see her. I get out my door, I'm gonna tear up probably. I get out my door, everybody in my neighborhood is on their lawn. And I was just like, whoa, that's amazing. And I get out and I was like, everybody had the same thought, and we're all doing this together. And maybe 5 minutes later, one of the neighbors yells down the street and is like, they found her. And so it was just really cool. And I was like, there is community here, and there's somebody that just needs to cultivate that. And I think we all have to kind of remember how to be neighbors again after the pandemic, because I think that is a big part of this conversation as well. So.
Awesome story. Thank you. Story? Yeah. And this is from The Power to Care for One Another. Service systems can never be reformed, so they will produce care. Care is the consenting commitment of citizens to one another. Care can't be produced, provided, managed, organized, administered, or commodified. Something only communities can provide. And I learned that lesson big during the pandemic. It was a really hard time for all of us. I lost friends, missed the community gatherings, Had to do all my work on Zoom, which I absolutely hate. But I've never spent more time in my neighborhood, and I've never felt more connected or more appreciative of my community. And I just wanted to share a few stories from my experience. Some of them from where I used to live in Seattle, a city of 800,000, but over 100 neighborhoods. So the scale is much like your neighborhoods. And now I live on Vashon Island, which is an island just a 20-minute ferry ride from Seattle. Very rural, about 10,000 people. So I got stories from both. But what I was amazed at in Seattle and Vashon and just my connections around the world was how people stepped up during the pandemic to provide mutual aid. On our island, we have an organization called Vashon Be Prepared to help people prepare for the coming earthquakes. We know we're going to get it at some point. And so we've organized small groups of neighbors, 10 to 12 households, and there's 250 of these. And somebody gets trained in emergency preparedness and then trains the other neighbors so that we're prepared for an earthquake. We get together regularly to practice, and we get lots of opportunities because we're always getting windstorms where trees come down and power goes out. So we come together to support each other, to use our chainsaws to cut up the trees. Our food's thawing in the freezer, so we make stone soup together. People share their generators. We support each other. So we were ready. We had those connections already. We knew who needed help. So when the pandemic came, we knew who needed the toilet paper and the eggs. And people would go out and shop for each other. They'd give them rides to the doctor. People making those connections that agencies didn't know who needed help. They weren't in a position to do that. It was neighbors who supported each other. This woman in Columbia City, my old neighborhood, she had a little free pantry where she made food available to people. And there were a lot of people, especially in need of food during the pandemic. So she put something on social media saying, I will build a little free pantry for anybody who's willing to have it installed in their yard, and will keep it full and keep it managed. She got 26 requests. Fortunately, some of the other neighbors stepped up and helped her build these little free pantries. And now they have built 125 little free pantries that are all around the Columbia City neighborhood. This is a little free pantry in a rural location on Vashon. Our senior center closed, so it started delivering meals to seniors, and volunteers came together to make those meals. The kids were no longer in school, especially during the summer, so we had a free lunch program and made lunches available, and people transported them to different locations on the island where they could be picked up. We've got lots of farmers on the island, so it supported people who donated to a fund so that people who needed food could get fresh bucks, which they used to acquire food at the food stands. Hillary Emmert, who was chair of the Interfaith Homelessness Task Force, put out a call asking for people to donate to a rent fund to help people pay their rent when they lost their jobs through the pandemic. Got over $300,000 donated to help people stay in their homes. The Sikh community in Seattle started cooking meals for healthcare workers. And they started cooking meals for people in their community. And a lot of them are Uber drivers, so they drove the food for free to people's homes. When the pandemic first hit, there were no masks for the healthcare workers. I don't know if you remember that. But some of the neighbors realized that a lot of people had stockpiled N95 masks because of the huge problem we're having with smoke from our forest fires on the West Coast. And so they asked people to donate those masks, and they got thousands of them, all done by volunteers in the community that we made available to the healthcare workers. And then we realized, well, there's no masks for the residents either. And this is not us. And so one of the neighbors, one of the people said, let's start making masks ourselves. And this isn't a story about, I'm not here to promote masks, I'm not here to promote mandates. The woman who led this effort is an anti-vaxxer. She was totally opposed to government mandates. She just cared about her neighbors and thought they'd be healthier if masks were available. So she put that together, and 80 people joined that group to make masks and drove them to everybody on the island. So everybody had, and they were fashionable masks, so people felt okay wearing them. And then just the community put together advertisements to encourage people to wear masks. Did them in Spanish because we have a large Spanish-speaking population. A lot of tourists come to the island, so we put up a sign saying we got a lot of old people and no hospitals, so please take care. Just whimsical things that artists did to try to get people, on board. People dressed up at the intersection, encouraging people to get tested. We didn't have really healthcare professionals who could do it, so people on the island came up with a low-tech way of doing testing that didn't require PPE, fancy equipment, or professionals. And it was written up in the New York Times and became something that they use in a lot of rural communities and a lot of the Native American reservations. And they staff these testing sites. They task the clinics all with volunteers. This is in our international district. Kiko Silvano was riding his bike through the neighborhood, and his favorite restaurant, he thought it was being boarded up. And so he went and talked to the owner, and he was just distressed because he was losing the restaurant. And the owner said, I'm just putting this up because I'm concerned about vandalism, because we aren't going to be open for business, although we are doing takeout. And Kyoka said, we're never going to get people to come if it just boarded up. So he put out a call on social media, and within a half hour, 6 Latino artists volunteered to create a mural on this business. Here they are. And they did it in the Japanese style. And this created a movement. And artists in all the neighborhoods started painting murals on these boarded up storefronts. And places that just looked desolate, all boarded up, it just became a source of pride for people. They put out messages about taking care of each other, about taking care of themselves. Keep going, keep growing, this too shall pass. Stay healthy, slow down, it's okay. But just things that improve people's morale. We put together a fund on the island to support artists who were having a hard time through the pandemic because they couldn't do any shows. And artists created these different panels on a community mural. Musicians on the island started doing concerts for free on the web. So every night we'd have concerts just to boost people's spirits and keep those connections going. This is in the Ballard neighborhood. Stephen Wall, he was practicing his bass guitar. It was nice weather, so he went outside to practice. And the neighbors started gathering around because they were just starving for something, something to happen. And he said, well, actually, I kind of suck at the bass guitar. What I'm really good at is opera singing. So he started doing his opera singing, and the next day he came back from work, and all the neighbors were gathered around waiting for him to return. And he had no choice but to do it again. He did it every night, did performances. This is another neighborhood where they have a regular, every Friday they do a Bubbles, Bubbly, and buses. And so they drink champagne and they have soap bubbles, and it's a major route for the buses. So they just want to encourage the bus drivers who had a really hard time during the pandemic and to welcome the passengers and just to connect as neighbors. And they're still doing it. Every week they get together. They just have so much fun doing it. There's another neighborhood, I didn't have any photos of it, but they got together every night to do a song together. Somebody would research a song, put the lyrics on the internet, and they'd all come out to the intersection and sing that song. And they're still doing it. We have lots of parades on Vashon, and we couldn't gather downtown during the pandemic where we usually have the parades. So somebody had this ingenious idea. It says, why don't we bring the parade to the people? And so the parade traveled 50 miles all around the island, and people could sit in their front yards and watch the parade. So here it is, people sitting watching. But just the ingenuity of community and the people's need to keep that community going strong. Oh, we have candidates for mayor. We don't have a local government, so we just have an unofficial mayor. And they run for a nonprofit organization. And so you vote for them by contributing money. So for every dollar they get a vote. And so it's just like normal elections. Whoever gets the most money wins. So this woman was this is a sheep that was running, actually got elected. And these girls ran collectively. They won the next year. My dad had his 92nd birthday. And we're trying to figure out how to observe that. And we went, my brother and I set up a table in his retirement complex. And we were having a nice dinner. And this woman showed up and started playing Happy Birthday to him, one of the neighbors. And then we looked up, and there was this guy driving by on a motorcycle with a Happy Birthday sign. And then looked behind him, and there was a whole caravan of cars from his church, from old friends, who came to wish him happy birthday. Sort of a drive-by happy birthday. But my dad said that was his best birthday ever. And then I did a socially distanced bag of strawberries to everybody who came. When my grandson turned 4, they did something somewhere in his neighborhood. And kids came in cars, they came by bicycle. He just loves firefighters. So he dressed up as a firefighter, and the local firefighters actually showed up in their fire engine. He was so excited. A lot of our places closed, like our public library. So people just got creative. And they somebody had an old Japanese fire engine, and they turned it into a bookmobile that goes around the island delivering books. Our theater closed. So in the back of a warehouse, we painted it all white, and we created a drive-in theater. Yeah, I was doing lots of nature photography during the pandemic, so I did a video of nature photography. That's being shown at the drive-in theater. Our athletic club shut down. So people just brought their exercise bicycles out to the beach. And it was great. We could connect. We could be socially distanced. We could have a great view. And this guy, he's somebody with developmental disabilities, Doug. And he was trying to figure out how he could contribute during the pandemic. And he had this idea. He says, how about if I deliver flowers to the people who are grieving, to the people who are isolated, to the people who've been real champions for our community during the pandemic. And he would take these flowers to people's homes and had the biggest smile. And just this incredible gift. And what I loved was what people from all walks of life found ways to support each other under really trying circumstances and being creative about how they could connect. So I think if we can do it during the pandemic, we can do it anytime. And I think now is the time to step up. I think during the pandemic, people really realized what they were missing. Those relationships, the personal contact. And there are so many, and I hope I outlined some of the key ones, so many reasons why this work is so absolutely important. Amanda Abrams said, in a world where the social fabric seems to be rapidly fraying, the economy is uncertain, the future of the planet is at risk, is there a better way to hit the reset button than to come back to the neighborhood level and begin to genuinely rely on one another again? So I think most of you came already convinced about the value of community. Hopefully that conviction's even stronger now. The hard part is, how do we actually build community? And how do we move beyond the people in this room to really make community? It's got to be about everybody. How do we make inclusive community? So that's the purpose of the workshops tomorrow. First workshop will be on engaging broad and inclusive participation. Sort of what are the keys to doing that? How do we go about doing our work and reaching out to the whole community and getting them included? The next one's really on asset-based community development. And how do you identify the resources in your community, the underutilized resources that you could tap to really do creative, powerful community work? The next one's on community-driven placemaking. And how can you shape your neighborhood in ways that reinforce that sense of community? And then finally, some time just spending some time, hopefully get some neighbors to come so you can collectively create a vision for your neighborhood and some action steps that could move you towards that vision. So we walk out of here with some things we can do to create
Neighbor power.
Yeah! Thank you. Thank you. So.
Thank you very much for that. I appreciate all the work you put in that.
Well, I think it's fun.
Morning, everybody. Morning. Yeah, thanks for coming back.
Neighbor.
So really enjoyed a couple hours of summer on Thursday night. Now we're back to winter, huh? So really looking forward to spending time with you this morning. Yesterday we talked about the value of community. Today we're talking about how do we really build community so we really have real neighbor power. That community can't just be a few self-selected leaders speaking for the community, but community is really about engaging everybody. That's when we can really make a difference. So the first session here is just some of the keys to building broad and inclusive community participation. How do we reach the people who aren't active now? So the first lesson I learned is make sure your equipment's working. It always works just beforehand. So the first lesson is have fun. I have a friend in Edmonton who says that the problem getting people engaged in community are those GD activists. I said, GD, what are you talking about? He said, the grim and determined. And it cracked me up because it describes so many of the self-proclaimed neighborhood leaders I know in Seattle who are always negative, who are always complaining. And it's like, who wants to join them? You know, most people get involved because they have a sense of hope that they can make a difference. They want to have fun. So the number one key to getting people engaged, I think, is have fun. Just want to share a few stories about groups that have learned how to have fun. First one is from, let me try this other one, see if this works any better. The first story is from, I'll find out in a second, Elgin, Illinois. So I was doing workshops in Elgin, and they gave me a tour, like I got with Diane yesterday of Sioux Falls, but this was of Elgin. So I'm going around the city of Elgin, and I saw this blue tulip, gigantic blue tulip in front of somebody's house. And I said, what's the story? And they said there was this guy who just loved to collect junk. And he got more and more junk. And his wife got on his case and made him take all the junk back to the dump. But every time he came back from the dump, he had more junk than when he left. And one time, some of you know this guy, one time he went and he saw this gigantic blue tulip sitting in the dump, and he says, man, that is too good to let go to waste. So he brought it back home, he planted it in his front yard, and he told all the neighbors, come over Friday night because I'm going to have a blue tulip party. And all the neighbors are scratching their heads because nobody had ever seen a blue tulip party before. But they were curious, so they came over. And they had the best time. Yeah. They had the best time. There was barbecue. There was local people on the block formed a band, and they were playing music. People were dancing. They just had a great time. They had so much fun that the next Friday night, that blue tulip showed up in front of somebody else's house. And that blue tulip now has been traveling around the city of Elgin for, I think, about 20 years now, and every week in front of somebody else's house. And it's built community in a way nothing else could have, because it's fun, it's engaging. It's just about getting people connected, right? This is another story. This is from Maple Ridge in British Columbia. And they try to figure out what's special about our neighborhood, what could bring people together. Well, this is kind of a rural area, and it turned out just about everybody was growing pumpkins in this neighborhood. So they have pumpkin events going on all the time. Here they're having a contest and weighing who has the biggest pumpkin. This one, they dress up pumpkins and have a costume contest. So Snoopy won this one. They have a pumpkin roll because it's a very hilly community, and they roll pumpkins down the hill and see which one can go the furthest. and they have a pumpkin catapult. They were kind of upset about new development going in nearby, and they received several pumpkins. This is in downtown Tacoma. Just like Sioux Falls, they were getting more and more people living downtown, but there just wasn't enough pedestrian safety. There were a couple of people who were hit by cars. They complained to the city. They had meeting after meeting. Nothing ever changed. Nothing ever happened. So finally, they said, let's just go out, and we can't get the city to put in crosswalks. So they put in their own crosswalks and painted them in the middle of the night. The next day, the city came out with pressure washers to take out the crosswalks. Thank you. Oh, you're great. Woo! They took out the crosswalks, and the community just put the crosswalks back in the next night. Finally, the city said, we're going to take you to court because it's illegal to create crosswalks. So they said, that's okay. We'll just create polka dots, squares. And finally, the city gave up and said, okay, what we're going to do about traffic safety? And they put up $500,000 for pedestrian improvements downtown. I don't think you have to take those kind of measures here in Sioux Falls. You've got a pretty responsive local government. Great to have them sponsor this neighbor festival to support neighborhood associations. But the key here is, how do you have fun, right? Second lesson I learned about getting people engaged is the importance of starting where people are at. I think this is incredibly important. There's several different levels to this. One is, the closer you involve people to where they actually live, the more likely they are to get engaged. You're going to get more people out probably for a citywide summit like this than you would in your particular neighborhood. You might get more people out in your neighborhood than you would on your block. But you're never going to get as high a percentage of participation than if you involve people right on the block where they live. Because if it's citywide, they're going to say, hey, I don't need to show up because you guys will be there. But if it's on your block, who's going to do it if I don't do it? If I don't get involved, my neighbor's going to know I'm not there. I'm going to be in trouble. Transportation's easier. Childcare is easier. You can actually see the immediate benefits from your participation because it's very local. So here's some examples. This is my grandson and his dog's looking out the window, but it just reminds me of kind of neighborhood watch. And that oftentimes at the block level, we're just organized around crime. And we're just looking out our windows for strangers, and we're kind of taught how to put deadbolt locks on our door to keep us safe indoors. And I think the way you get safety isn't by closing yourself in, it's about reaching out to your neighbors. And I always say that safest neighborhoods are the ones that don't focus on safety. They just focus on what's important to the neighbors. And if you build those connections, people are safer, they're healthier, they're more prepared for disaster. So it's really about how do we build strong relationships at the local level. In New Zealand, they don't call them neighborhood watches, they call them neighborhood support areas. So the key isn't to watch out for others, it's about supporting one another. In Edmonton, in Alberta, they have a program called Block Connectors, where they train people at the block level how to have conversations with their neighbors to find out what their skills are, what their interests are, so they can bring people together around shared interests. They can bring people who have needs together with those who have the skills to help meet those needs. So it's been a great way to connect neighbors around their gifts. In Shreveport, Louisiana, they call it community renewal. And they have a community renewal team of over 50,000 people who've just made a simple pledge about how they're going to care for their neighbors. Specific things they're going to do to care for their neighbors. And they've organized over 1,800 blocks around that in Shreveport. In Lawrence, Massachusetts, they bring neighbors together at the block level just to begin by having dinner together and then having discussions about how can we live together as a community, what are our priorities, how can we support one another. So they don't have a particular agenda around care or safety, just about what's important to the neighbors. And I love what's happening in Rotterdam and Zomeren. This is one block in Rotterdam, largely refugees. And they kept meeting with city officials because they had concerns about crime in their neighborhood. And they had concerns about the level of cleanliness on their street. And they had meeting after meeting after meeting, and nothing ever changed. And finally, one of the neighbors said, instead of spending all our time trying to get the city to do this, why don't we do it? We're actually in a better position to have crime prevention and to keep our street clean than the city is. Let's do it ourselves. So they started some measures to keep their area clean. They had regular block parties, and they started a movement. And it's called the Opzoomer movement. And if you have at least 4 public events on your block during the year, you can get this symbol on your block. So it's sort of a status symbol. Everybody wants it. So now they've organized just about all the blocks in Rotterdam, self-organized by the community. And one of the coolest things they do, I think, is bring the neighbors together to have a discussion about what are the values by which we're going to live together and support one another. And then they create a big sign. They put it on the side of a house on the block to remind them about the commitments they've made to one another. I know we've got people here of Dutch heritage. Can anybody translate this? I can make it up. But generally the signs say we're going to welcome people into our neighborhood. We're going to support the children in our neighborhood. We're going to keep our neighborhood clean. The signs differ from block to block, but that's usually the message. Block parties are a fantastic way. I know you do that during neighborhood night out, but it would be cool to do it like all summer long, right? In the UK, they have a big lunch where people all across the country get together on one day and all eat lunch together, but in their own blocks. Then they started closing the roads so that they could do play again, like we used to do when I was a kid, play in the streets. Now it's not safe. Well, instead of just closing the street for block parties, they close it for neighborhood play, one afternoon a week. And it's not just the kids, it's also the adults who get involved in that. This is in the Sellwood neighborhood in Portland, where they were concerned about traffic speeding through their neighborhood. So they came together and created a mural in the middle of their intersection to slow down the traffic, but also to create a sense of pride in their neighborhood. And then they created street furniture that went out from that. So they have a little bench there. They've got a tea station that they fill up every day so the neighbors can get together, drink tea, and connect with each other. When they first did it, they did it without a permit, and the city finally said, okay, you can do this, but you need to get a permit. More and more people kept doing it, so then they finally just said, okay, you just do it. And I know you've had a few of those here, I think. There was one in the All Saints neighborhood last time I was here. Little free libraries popping up absolutely everywhere. You know, it's just a great way to connect neighbors. This is one where they have one little free library for adult books and one for children's books. When I was in Kitchener, Ontario, the neighborhood groups came together and they built 50 little free libraries in one day. So just a great way to really disperse them out to the community, getting people with woodworking skills together with people who were connected with community to install little free libraries. And people have taken it and figured out all kinds of things to do with this. This is a little free art gallery where you're invited to contribute little pieces of art and put them in and take your own art. This is my dad's retirement community, and they have a puzzle exchange. So, you know, after you can only do a puzzle so many times, and you can leave your old puzzles in here and pick up a new puzzle. So all kinds of things you can do with Little Free. This is in the Ballard neighborhood of Seattle, where they planted 1,200 street trees in a day. I know you're doing some of that same thing here, but it's a great way to connect neighbors, particularly training people so that they can plant their own trees, and then they take care of them, have pride in them. Creating community gardens on vacant lots. Even creating gathering spaces in your front yard. So this is in Taiwan, where they had no park around, so people just created little parks in their front yard with tables, so invite neighbors to come over and eat together, play games together. Another one in Taiwan where they just put up signs in front of the house to show what's special about that family. So this woman's family works in the mines, and they put a miner in front of their house. This person fixes up houses. This person's a beautician. Did a similar thing in the Netherlands, putting up what's special. This is the children's art in the front, an artist showing the paintbrush. This is in Toronto. This is in public housing, very dense housing, to show that this doesn't just happen in single-family neighborhoods. It's also in apartment buildings. I do a lot of work in Singapore, and there, each floor of these high-rises is a neighborhood, right? So here are some of the tenants in a large complex who built their own playground. This guy organized everybody in his apartment building, so he's got somebody on each floor of the apartment building who he calls a connector. And that person is responsible for welcoming new people onto the floor. That person is responsible for making matches between people who need support and somebody can offer it, whether that's a child or whether that's a person with disabilities or an older person, but making those matches. This is in Waterloo, Ontario, where the neighborhood had a lot of front porches. I've seen some great front porches here, but they have front porch concerts where local groups will play music on the porch, and all the neighbors gather around to listen to it. I was in Waterloo one day where I went to 50 concerts in one afternoon, just in one neighborhood, just walking down the block. But a great way to connect neighbors, and I think didn't All Saints do this? Yeah, during the pandemic. Fantastic, yeah. This is in our Wedgwood neighborhood of Seattle, where a mother and her son with disabilities have a red flyer wagon, and they take it around house to house, and they get people to contribute the magazines that they're done reading, and then they go to the next house, and that person can get their choice of magazines and contribute their old magazines. So just a great way to connect neighbors and to recycle materials. So in Australia, where they do regular welcome dinners at the block level to welcome new residents onto the street, particularly people who are new immigrants and refugees. So here's just a few of the things you could do at the block level. And the more kinds of activities you have, the more different ways people can be engaged, the stronger your block's going to be, right? So crime prevention, emergency preparedness, block parties, skills exchanges, sharing equipment and vehicles, buying in bulk, policy discussions, where people have, they did this in Chicago around the housing affordability issue. Each block had discussions about solutions around housing affordability, which fed up to the neighborhood associations, which fed up to city policy. Yeah. Yeah, I'll make these available, so whatever way you can get them out, I've got I'm happy to share the PowerPoints. Yeah.
One idea for me triggers four more, and then that triggers four more people.
Yeah, no, there's a lot to write down. So just all the things you could do at the block level. And if you can get really active blocks that are then connected to your neighborhood association, you're really deep into the community. There are neighborhood associations that just have a representative from every street in their neighborhood. And part of their job is just to connect with all the people on the street regularly to hear what their concerns are, to feed back what the neighborhood association is doing, and look for opportunities to connect them with the neighborhood as a whole. Second part of starting where people are is to start with what I call their bumping place. Community is all about building relationships. And you build relationships by bumping into the same people over and over and over again. So if you want to build community, you need places to bump into other people. And the closer those places are to where you live, the more likely you are to bump into the same people over and over and over again. So if you want to build community, you need places to bump. And so this is the bus stop in Rainier Beach. That's a great bumping place. But sometimes you need some ways to really get people to, oftentimes people are standing there and not looking at one another. They're just looking at their cell phones. So ways to get people engaged with one another. Sometimes people put up little coffee stands there, things to just encourage people to interact. The skate park might be a great place for young people to bump. And so if you want to reach out, you figure out where do people hang out? Where can we reach young people? Well, it might be the skate park. The playground's another great bumping place. Local cafes are another great bumping place. Community gardens. Senior centers, great place to meet seniors. So oftentimes we're trying to get everybody to come to our venue, right? If we really want to get people engaged, we need to figure out who's underrepresented in our work and where do they hang out, and start having discussions with them. Go to where they're at. Yeah, the library is a great bumping place. You know, you get people there from absolutely the whole range of the community. You know, you get homeless people, you get business people, you get kids, you get seniors. Everybody's in the library. The problem is you often don't interact very much. You're quiet. Libraries are starting to change. There's a lot of libraries now that have a program called Check Out a Person. And you can go and you can reserve some time with somebody that you'd like to learn more about their story. It might be you want to spend some time talking with a homeless person. You might want to spend some time talking to a refugee. You might want to spend some time talking to somebody who has a different experience than your own so that you can learn about them and get to know them as a person. This is Occidental Park in Pioneer Square in Seattle, which I love because they created a bumping space that brings people of all kinds of differences together. It was a place where a lot of homeless people hung out. It's still a place where a lot of homeless people hang out, but there's also people, local employees who hang out there. There's kids, families who hang out there because there are activities for everybody. There's children's games, there's music playing, there's food trucks. So you have people, you know, who are homeless and business people playing table tennis together, right? And playing chess together. A third part of starting where people are is to start with their language and culture. Now that's pretty obvious. If somebody moves into the neighborhood and doesn't speak English, you need to figure out how can you do some translation, how can you do some interpretation, otherwise they can't get involved. But too oftentimes in our community work, we're using our specialized language. We're talking about land use terms that people can't figure out what we're talking about. You know, it's an L3 zone. It's just a big building, right? So it's about, or in environmental work, we use terms like sustainability and we use terms like resilience, and people don't know what we're talking about. So it's really important to use language that people understand. Otherwise, they think they don't have enough expertise to be involved. They might not even know what we're talking about. Right? Yeah, to start with their culture. So the neighborhood I used to live in, Columbia City in Seattle, they said it was the most diverse zip code in the United States, 98118. So we called our neighborhood the neighborhood of nations. And it was a real treasure to have experienced so many different cultures in one place, but it was also a challenge because we often couldn't communicate very well with each other. So we tried to figure out, what do we have in common? And we realized we all love to dance. So we have world dance parties where everybody comes and we teach each other our dance. The first world dance party we had, we learned 12 different dances in one night. And it was great because it just brought people from all walks of life, you know, from kids to elders. Just had a great time. Yeah, older people, young people. She was our DJ. We had so much fun that now we just do it on a monthly basis. All organized by just neighborhood people. And again, an example of having fun, right? Fourth part of starting where people are is to start with their networks. We often get frustrated because people are so apathetic. Why won't they join our neighborhood association, right? And we forget that most people are already organized. They just don't belong to our association. There are dozens of associations, formal and informal, in every neighborhood. Some of those are faith-based, you know, and maybe in a local church there are lots of associations. There might be a youth group, a men's group, women's group, a mission group, a choir, you know, all kinds of groups just in one place. Right? There are senior groups, there's youth groups, there's hobby groups, there's sports groups, there's history groups, there's art groups, all kinds of groups in every place. And so the key is, how can you reach out? And people only have so much time. They don't have time to join multiple organizations. So really trying to figure out, what are the other networks in our neighborhood, business groups in our neighborhood? And how can we reach out to those and find common interests and work together across associations? So this was in the Netherlands, and it was a very low-income neighborhood, the Voorstad neighborhood in Deventer. And the neighborhood association was trying to figure out how do we get more people engaged. So they tried to identify some different networks. And one of the key networks they identified was a knitting group in the neighborhood. It's a group of 9 women who was knitting. And they got together every once to knit, but also to socialize. So the neighborhood association talked with them and said, you know, we're really trying to figure out how do we create more pride in our neighborhood? How do we create a sense of identity? And these knitters came up with a great idea. And they said, you know, we all love the Go Ahead Eagles, which is the local football club that's located in their neighborhood. How about if we create scarves, we'll knit scarves in the colors of the Go Ahead Eagles and encourage people in the neighborhood to wear those? So they started knitting these scarves. It's my friend Yop Hoffman, who's a neighborhood leader, wearing one of the scarves at the football game. And more people got it. This became a movement. So a whole section of the stadium now is people knitting scarves during the football game. And then they started saying, hey, how about if we start stitching these different scarves together and create a really big scarf? And so they started parading this around the stadium at halftime. And it just grew larger and larger and larger. And then they started using these scarves to cover some of the historic structures in Deventer. And then they decided to cover a whole house with these scarves. And the reason they picked this house is it's the home of Syrian refugees. And they wanted to show the warmth that they had for this family. And then their ultimate goal that they just achieved last year was to tie all those scarves together so that they could surround their entire neighborhood, 5 kilometers, with a scarf that they hung all the way around the neighborhood. And it just evoked a lot of pride, but also in the process, they involved hundreds of people in the knitting. So it's just a great way to get people connected, to start making connections across the neighborhood. So don't overlook any group in your neighborhood. You know, it might be the dog walkers. Sometimes those are the people who get involved in the crime prevention. So they're just regular walking around the neighborhood at night, making sure everybody's feeling safe and it's okay to be out. There's all kinds of groups. I live on Vashon Island now, and we don't have local government, so people have just kind of do things themselves. I think we have more associations than people on the island. We had a neighborhood association, a community council, and it had fallen apart over time, so we decided to bring it back together. We started having conversations with people, and they said, you know, the problem with the old neighborhood association was they thought they were the representatives of our community. And it was only 15 people. And we have hundreds of associations on the island. How can this one group speak for all of us, right? We have, you know, a very active chamber of commerce. We have lots of environmental groups. We have lots of arts groups. We have lots of farming groups. We have youth groups. We have senior groups. So we said, why don't we make our community council a council of councils, an association of associations? So we tried to identify what are all the key sectors in our community that are organized into associations. Well, one was the faith-based communities. We have lots of churches, synagogues on the island. So we said one is faith-based. A second one is business-based. A third one is arts-based. A fourth one is food-based and farms. A fifth one is youth-based. A sixth one is our Latino community. On and on, we identified that, I think, 10 different sectors. And with each of those sectors, we identified all the different associations that were connected to that sector. And so our community council now is made up of liaisons to each of those sectors. So their job is to connect with all those different associations in their sector, to hear what their concerns are, and to also feed back to them what the community council's doing, so that we can work as one community rather than as hundreds of separate associations. And that way we have a much stronger voice with county council, because we really do represent the community, all the voices, and not just a few voices. The fifth part of starting where people are is to start with their passions. So oftentimes we start with what we're passionate about. what we think everybody else should care about because we care about it. And when people don't join us, we say, God, people are apathetic. Everybody cares deeply about something. So rather than spend all our time trying to convince somebody to care about what we care about, it's much better to spend time listening to what people themselves care about. Because if you can if you can find out what people care about, give them a sense they can do something about it, they're much more likely to get engaged than if you spend a lot of time trying to convince them to care about what you care about. Right? I worked with Queen Anne Community Council in Seattle at one point, and they wanted to reach out to the community. So I said, how about just doing a survey to find out what are the issues that are important to people in the community? They said, well, we're not so sure we want to do that because our primary issue is around zoning in the neighborhood. We're not sure everybody shares our interest in zoning. So you just got to decide, what are you about? Are you about zoning or are you about building broad-based community participation? So this is again, where I live on Vashon. We just had an open space session and asked people to identify what were they interested in, what kind of projects were they interested in, what would they like to get involved in. And people stood up with their paper saying, hey, I want to start up a community garden. I want to start up a crime prevention group. I want to start up a local arts group. And then people could vote with their feet and just join the group that was most interested in them. And if they got enough participation, they'd make it happen. Sixth part of starting where people are is to start with their call. Too oftentimes, the only call we use is the meeting call. And the meeting call is the worst call in the world. How fun is a meeting? Right? Yeah. And a lot of people, they just go to meetings, they don't see any results. A lot of people are shy. They go to meetings, they just sit there, they don't feel like they're contributing anything. That's how much they care that they actually show up. So if we really want to get people engaged, we need to use all the calls. I learned this from a friend who's a duck hunter. He told me for every different kind, there's a different call for every different kind of duck. Right? And too oftentimes, the only call we use is the loon call. And we wonder why only loons show up at our meetings. You get what you call, right? So if you really want to get everybody involved, you need to use all the calls. And so it's not just the meeting call, it's the social call. It's the project call. It's all the different ways you can get people engaged. We do need to have some meetings, right? But meetings aren't for everybody. So find lots of different ways to get people engaged. People just want to roll up their sleeves and make a difference in the neighborhood. Don't make them have to go to meetings in order to do that. Third thing I learned is don't sit on your assets. And the point here is that absolutely everybody has gifts to give to the community. Everybody does. And I like to think of them as three kinds of gifts. One are gifts of the head, their knowledge. Second one are gifts of the heart, their passions. And a third are gifts of the hands, their skills. Absolutely everybody has these. Everybody. So here's an example of just the varied skills you can get in one neighborhood. I was doing some work in Lewisham in South London in England. And met this physician on the right-hand side. And he said the number one complaint he had from his patients was that they were lonely and depressed. And he said, that's something I can't solve with medicine. And so he organized a time bank. Do you know about time banks? It's where people will do skills exchanges. So, somebody says, I'm a plumber. I will do plumbing for people in the neighborhood who need help with plumbing. And for every hour of time that plumber provides, he gets an hour of somebody else's skills in the neighborhood. And it's really cool because it it recognizes everybody has something to offer. So the plumber might need a babysitter. The plumber might need a graphic artist to help, with his website. So it's just a way to exchange outside of the formal economy. But it's also just a great way to make connections within the neighborhood. It's a really cool kind of program, and they're happening all over the world now. And what I love is everybody's time is valued the same. So the plumber is the same as the planner, is the same as the gardener, is the same as the child care worker. An hour is an hour is an hour. So he brought me to a Bring and Fix event to illustrate all the things you could get done by your neighbors. So this Bring and Fix event was if you pledge an hour of your time, you got to bring something to this event that was broken and get it fixed. It's kind of like a repair cafe as well. So this woman's fixing people's clothes. She's a seamstress. So that's an example of one kind of skill in the neighborhood. This person's fixing fixing small appliances. Kids are fixing people's bicycles. She's fixing somebody's hair, fixing somebody's back, helping somebody with their IT, making a smoothie together using a bicycle. She's really happy because she got her high heel fixed by a neighbor. This neighbor's offering skydiving lessons. But just think how you could use all those gifts, all those skills to do really creative community work that isn't necessarily meeting-based. So I know there's incredible gifts in this room, and I'd like to uncover some of those and help you think about, too oftentimes in our community work, we're just looking for the person who's a good speaker or the person who can take minutes or and we ignore all the other gifts that are out there that we could use to do really powerful community work. So I'd like us just to reflect on sort of what are some of the gifts in this room. So pair up with someone you don't know, okay? I think now you're probably sitting with your neighbors, but pair up with somebody you don't know so well. And I'd just like you to have like a 6-minute conversation with that person. 3 minutes to find out what that person's gifts are, and then 3 minutes for that person to find out what your gifts are. Okay? So, we don't have time to go through all the gifts in this room, but just think about how you could use all those different gifts. The Ella plants, right? The finance, working with kids, being able to connect with different people in the community. Use all those gifts, the historic knowledge, to build really powerful communities, right? Too oftentimes we're just looking for the good speaker, the good grant writer. And just think about how we could use the musician, the carpenter, the person who's passionate about kids, the person who's passionate about history, to really do powerful community work. And too oftentimes when we're trying to recruit people, we look at the person who's like the finance person, maybe the accountant who lives in our neighborhood, and say, hey, you're the accountant, that's your gift. We'd like you to keep the books for our neighborhood association. This poor person, that's all they do, all 40 hours a week is accounting. The last thing they want to do is more accounting. So it's really important to reach out and find out what other gifts they might have. What are they really passionate about? What would they enjoy doing when they aren't, on the job? Because everybody's got lots of gifts. Results. Okay. Talked before about how so many people are, we think they're apathetic because they don't get involved, that people are feeling powerless. So the last thing you want to do is involve people in something where they don't see any change. They go to meeting after meeting after meeting and nothing ever happens. So for people who are feeling powerless, you probably don't want to start with issues like world peace or climate change. It's like you don't see much progress, right? Doesn't mean we shouldn't work on those big issues. We're never going to work on the big issues if they don't think they even have power on their own street. So it's really important for people to see results. Start with small, winnable things where they can really see they're making a difference in their community. And once people have a sense of their power, of their agency, then they're more likely to work on bigger things. It's just, they aren't likely to start there. Fifth part is to lead by stepping back. Oh, one other thing I should say about gifts is that it's really important to ask people and invite people in, not just to identify their gifts, but to actually invite them to share their gifts. There was a study done in Canada by United Way of Canada that found that 93% of the people who volunteered in United Way volunteered because somebody asked them to contribute their gifts. Very few people are going to step up and say, hey, I've got a gift. I'd love to get involved. Generally, what happens is somebody knows that person and knows what their gifts are and asks them to contribute their gifts, and they're very likely to say yes because of that relationship, because of the invitation. Okay? So the fifth part is starting where people are is the importance of leading by stepping back. That too oftentimes it's just one person who thinks of themselves as the voice of the community. Right? And it's trying to lead. And there are very few people around them. So it's important to have new style of leadership, where instead of just one person just doing it, it's more collective leadership, it's shared leadership. Recognizing no one person has all the skills to be a good leader. One person might be a good talker, but another person's a good listener, which is even more important than the good talker. Another person might make a great cake that would get people to come to the gatherings. Another person might be good with finance. So you need all those gifts if you're going to have really strong leadership in the community. It's actually more important, I think, to have connectors than leaders. The person who can help connect all those gifts in the community and get people engaged. The iron rule of community organizing is never do for people what they can do for themselves. So oftentimes, as leaders in our neighborhood, we think nobody can do it quite as well as us. So we're out there trying to do everything, trying to save the world. And what we need to recognize is to build on everybody else's gifts and to allow them to step up into leadership roles as well. Lao Tzu said, when the leader's work is done, the people will say, we did it ourselves. Again, it's not community if it's just a few people. It's community if everybody feels ownership for the results. Sixth part of getting broad, inclusive engagement is taking time to celebrate success and recognizing the people who help make that happen. So oftentimes we're just jumping from one issue to the next, meeting after meeting. We need to celebrate so people recognize the accomplishments, so they feel like it's really worthwhile to be part of the organization. We need to recognize the contributions that everybody makes. You know, people like to be humble. They say they don't want to be recognized, but people appreciate that somebody recognizes their participation, that their gifts that they've offered to the community. So in Seattle and many places in the world now, they're doing Neighbor Appreciation Day. One day during the year where people are encouraged to get together to recognize caring neighbors in their neighborhood. And not just the usual leaders, but people who've just done something nice for their neighbors. So in Seattle, I'd go to 20 events in one day around the city where people are having a breakfast, or they're having a wine at night, or they're having a potluck, or some kind of celebration to celebrate and recognize caring neighbors. We have kids in the schools design greeting cards that depict caring neighbors. And the winner gets printed on a card that's printed by our local insurance company. And inside it just says, thank you, neighbor. And we make those cards available so that people can take them to their neighbors to say, hey, thank you for watching my kids after school. Thank you for watering my garden while I was on vacation. Just simple things that make community work. Really important to recognize people's contributions. Whew. So let's move on. I've got a lot to cover, so it's got to kind of keep moving. Next one I want to talk about is just what are all those treasures in your neighborhood that you can utilize? So oftentimes we're looking outside our community for the resources. Can't do anything until we get a grant, right? So I want to just have us reflect on what are those underutilized resources that every neighborhood has. The problem is oftentimes this is the map that we're looking at when we're thinking about our neighborhoods. It's often the map that's created by agencies of all types that want to help our communities, where they do a needs assessment to figure out what are all the problems in the community and how can we be the most helpful. Very legitimate exercise. The problem is it often stops there. When I was a community organizer, this was my map of the neighborhood because I knew it was easy if I could find a crisis, if I could find something people were really angry about in the neighborhood, I could pull them together so they could fight for change. But if there wasn't an issue in the neighborhood, I really didn't know how to bring people together. It's like if there wasn't a crisis, I was pretty depressed. Really sick, right? My friend John McKnight was an organizer in Chicago, and this was his map of the neighborhood because he was looking for all the problems that he could organize people around. He said once they went and they made their list of demands, they went to City Hall and found out City Hall was bankrupt. There was no money to respond. He said, what do we do? And he finally realized, he says, you know, we're looking at the wrong map of our neighborhood. This is a picture of John. And he created a new map of the neighborhood. And he said, instead of focusing on what's wrong, how about if we focus on what's strong? And he created this map of exactly the same neighborhood, but instead of focusing on what was missing, they focused on what was there. Very different picture of the same place. And he and his colleague, Jody Kretzmann, formed an institute they call the Asset-Based Community Development Institute at Northwestern University. And they surveyed 300 communities across North America. And they found that the communities that were the most successful with their community building efforts started not with this map, but with this map. So why do you think this might be a more powerful way, more powerful basis for doing community work? It brings hope. Like I said before, some people gravitate to negativity, but most people get involved because they have a sense of hope. We can make change. Great. Yeah, much, and you know, a lot more pride. It's like, we're proud of our place. We want to make it even better rather than, oh, we live in the worst dump, right? Yeah. So I knew it worked. I didn't know why, so thank you. That's great. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't look at that other map because there are real problems in many of our neighborhoods, right? But we're going to be in a much better position to deal with those problems if we can get more people engaged and identify our strengths. Then when we come to this city and ask for action, we've got the whole community. We've got real power. We don't have to scream. We don't have to yell. Okay, so we could go on with this for a long time, but you get it, right? So I just want to quickly go through what are those different resources in our community, particularly the resources that are underutilized. We already talked a little bit about the gifts that everybody has to give. The problem in our society is that we have labeled huge sections of our community not by their gifts. We label people by what they're missing. Just like neighborhoods where we focus on their problems rather than on their strengths, we do that with individuals, whole groups of individuals. What are some labels we put on large sections of our community that label them not by their gifts, but by their deficiencies? Disability. Disabled people. We talked about learning disability. When you think about a person who's disabled, do you think about somebody with gifts? No, you think about somebody who has great needs. What else? Homeless. We think about a homeless person. You think about lots of gifts? No, you think about what they're missing, a home. What else do we have? Addicts. Yeah, addicts. Again, focusing on their addiction rather than on their strengths. What else? Yeah, old. I get increasingly sensitive to that one. Right? And yet, who's got more life experience and knowledge, you know? What else do we have? The other end of the spectrum, young people. We hardly ever talk about young people anymore without that adjective, at risk, right? And young people are at risk. We're all at risk. But it's only part of the description, right? You lift off that label of at risk. Who's got more energy than young people? Who understands technology better than young people? Who's got more time? Who's got more at stake in the future of our community than young people? Who understands young people better than young people? And we sit around in our neighborhood groups and talk about the youth problem. We don't have a youth problem. The problem is we aren't engaging the gifts of young people because we're too focused on what they're missing. So there's all kinds of labels. Here's some of the others. Poor person, non-English speaking, where we're focusing on what they're missing, English. They might be great connectors in the community because they know lots of languages that we don't know. Single parent, addict, offender, old person. So we've actually, most of the people in our community, we've written out of community. Because the basis of community is sharing our gifts with one another. And if we don't identify people's gifts, we think of them, and they think of themselves as clients rather than as citizens. And the relationship is with service providers rather than with neighbors. And I'm not denying that people have needs. Everybody in this room has needs, right? I've got some disabilities, my memory gets worse every year. My eyes are getting worse every year. My hearing's getting worse. But I don't say, I have disabilities. I try to think of some gifts I have. And yet there's whole sections of the community that we define solely in terms of their disabilities, and we miss out on all their gifts. So community is all about recognizing every one of us has needs and every one of us has gifts. And community is about sharing our gifts with one another to meet one another's needs. So if we really want to get people engaged, we need to lift off those labels and focus on everybody's gifts. A friend of mine, Damon Lynch, who's a minister in a church in Cincinnati, Ohio, and this church has a meal program for homeless men in the basement. And the members of the church serve meals to the homeless men. Finally, somebody in the congregation got this idea and says, why don't we interview these men, find out what their gifts are? Turns out a bunch of these men like to cook. And they said, would you like to help cook the meals in the soup kitchen? They were overjoyed. Nobody ever thought to ask them that before. And after a while, the homeless men and the members of the church are cooking and eating together. And it was kind of hard to tell who were the providers and who were the clients because it wasn't about services anymore. It was about community. And some of these men formed a jazz group, and they played during the meals. Some of the men realized they had backgrounds in construction and started a construction group together. It's all about lifting up, taking off those labels and focusing on people's gifts to build community. This is in Whakatane in New Zealand. This is a center for people with disabilities. But what I love about this center is they focus on people's gifts. So they started up a community cafe. This is kind of in an industrial area. So they have a community cafe, and workers in the local industries come there to eat and to get coffee and to socialize. And it's been a great way to make connections between people with disabilities and the people in the local factories. They started a community-led education where people in the community are teaching their skills, their knowledge to one another, whether that's history of the community, or whether that's about how to grow aloe. They're teaching their gifts. And what I love is that some of the people with disabilities are some of the teachers. They started up a time bank. And again, it's everybody's involved sharing their gifts with one another. So it's people with disabilities and people who aren't labeled with disabilities sharing their gifts with each other. They started up micro enterprises, people with disabilities starting up their own small businesses. So I went to a fair. This woman was just starting to make knit baby clothes. And I had just found out that my daughter was pregnant, so I bought a bunch of clothes from her. This person is creating compost from the worm casings and selling that. This person came up with a great idea and said, there's a real need for pet caskets. So he builds pet caskets and sells those. There was no other market for that. They have a thrift store there somebody donated an old VW, and there were people, some of the factory workers in the neighborhood were working with people in the center to fix up the car, and they couldn't get it working. So finally, some of the people in the center had this idea and says, why don't we cut this car in half? And they refurbished the car, made it look really cool. And I was there for the opening of this project, but they unveiled it, and they have a car that's crashing through their building. But it was so cool to see how people in this Center for Disabilities and the workers in the surrounding community had connected with each other to do some really cool community work. Second asset that's in every community are the community associations. And I talked about this a fair amount already, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. But just recognizing that there are dozens of formal and informal associations in every neighborhood. Just, the people the guys who get together and drink coffee together in the morning. People who just have relationships, the knitting group, the book club, the soccer team and their parents, the PTA, all the different church groups. There are so many associations in every neighborhood, and you're going to be most effective if you can make connections with those different networks in your neighborhood. So here's an example of doing that. This is in Wodonga, in Victoria. And there was a neighborhood association that wanted to start a community garden. And so they tried to figure out where to do it. And there was a local church that had a large grassy area in front. So they said, could we create a community garden here? And the church said, sure. Well, then they were trying to figure out how to create the raised beds. So they're looking for people who had woodworking skills. So they started thinking about what network do we have in our neighborhood that could help us with that? And they contacted the men's shed. I don't know if you know about men's sheds. They have them in every place in Australia, but it's a warehouse full of power tools. And retired men get together and make things for the community, largely out of wood, but maybe metal, whatever skills they have. And it's a great way for the men to socialize, to talk about issues that they're having, and to contribute to the community. So they contacted the men's shed, and the men's shed said, sure, we'll get involved, and they built the raised beds. And then they tried to figure out, how can we reach other people who aren't engaged in our neighborhood association? And they reached out to the Refugee Association, the Mutual Assistance Association. Said, would you like to get involved in the garden? They said, yeah, we'd love to grow food that's indigenous to our culture because we can't get it in the local supermarket. And then they put up a sign at the senior center saying, would you like to get involved in our community garden? And it turns out a lot of the seniors were retired farmers who had great knowledge about growing things and had a passion for growing things. So they got involved in the community garden. Well, the crops grew, and they realized we have way more produce than we can use ourselves. So they realized there was a commercial kitchen in this church. And they said, could you use your kitchen to make meals? And so they started cooking meals. The women's group from the local church got involved. Across the street is an agency for people with developmental disabilities. They got involved. And they are now no longer the people with disabilities. They are the community chefs. And they're so proud to be cooking for the community. And all these groups work together to make hundreds and hundreds of meals for people who otherwise would have no food at all. That's the power of community, the power of working across all the associations. The neighborhood association couldn't have pulled this project off by themselves. They needed all the other networks in the community to make it successful. So, you can do some through the internet, you can do some maybe the local library, or you can go to places where people often meet to find out what are some of the groups that have reserved the space. It might be Alcoholics Anonymous or whatever. Just finding out what the associations are. But the key one is just talking to your neighbors. So part of what you want to do is not just find out what are their gifts, not just their knowledge and their skills and their passions, but also what are their relationships. What groups are they involved in? How are they connected with their neighbors? Okay? Third asset that's in every place are government and local agencies, right? And what I submit is that every agency also has incredible underutilized assets. Because if you think about it, agencies focus their resources on their narrow mission. And to the extent that the resources aren't needed for their mission, they often go underutilized. And those are resources that could perhaps be tapped by your neighborhood association. So just give you some examples. This is in Limburg in the Netherlands. We had a group of civil servants come to Seattle where I did a workshop for the civil servants about how they could better work with the community. And a couple of the people who showed up were firefighters. And they said, we're having a terrible problem trying to connect with the community. And I said, what's the problem? They said, we keep doing these fire safety workshops and nobody shows up. How do we get people to come to our fire safety workshops? And I said, that's not what I do. I'd go out and listen to the neighbors and find out what they care about and think about, are there ways you can help support the neighbors around their priorities? So they called me up all excited and said, could you come back to the Netherlands? We want to show you what we're doing. They picked me up in this fire engine, which had always been a dream of mine to be in a fire engine. And they took me to the fire station, and they said they had gone out to the neighborhood and interviewed the neighbors and found out that a lot of the neighbors wanted to start up community kitchens. And they realized that every one of their fire stations had a kitchen. And so they invited the neighbors to come in, and now they cook and they eat together. And as they cook and eat together, they talk about fire safety. So it was a win for the fire department because they were able to connect with the neighbors, win for the neighbors because they were able to use this underutilized resource to do something they were passionate about. This is in my old neighborhood of Columbia City, where we had this idea and thought, well, the school is an underutilized resource. Again, their mission is to educate young people. So the school was only open during school hours. It was not open at night. It was not open weekends. It was not open during the summer. It was not open during holidays. Our schools are used about 18% of the time. How many factories could operate their physical facility 18% of the time and stay in business? Right? So we were able to get the school to open up the school building at night for community use. This is our former mayor, Norm Rice, here helping with the opening of the school. And in the classrooms, community members taught their skills for free to other community members. So somebody taught the history of the neighborhood. Somebody else taught about how to repair bicycles. Somebody else taught about organic gardening. And it was just a way for people to offer their skills for free. It's a place where people would help children with their homework at night, where children would help adults learn how to use the computer. It was a place where the cafeteria became a place where we cooked community meals at night, where the auditorium became a place for community concerts and community events, where the gymnasium became a place for community recreation, where the community came in then in turn in the day and offered their skills for free to the school. So it was a win for the school as well for the community, making that partnership. Where we tore up the asphalt around the school and put in a community garden. That's a place where kids in the school learn how to garden, but a place where neighbors who don't have backyards can garden. They work together. So there's all kinds of underutilized resources in our neighborhoods from local agencies. Sunshine Coast in Australia, I worked with a group of nonprofit organizations, and they realized that every nonprofit had underutilized resources. One had an accountant that wasn't busy all the time. Another had a van that wasn't used all the time. Another one had a color printer that they could make available. So they formed the virtual community warehouse. And they share their resources across the nonprofits. One had an outreach worker who could reach out to the community, said, if we're doing that outreach, can we do it on behalf of all of the nonprofits rather than each organization fending for itself? Incredible underutilized assets. Next one, which we're kind of getting to, is the built and natural environment. And again, recognizing the incredible, I mean, you have incredible natural environment here. The falls and the river are an incredible asset. In some ways, you've just kind of rediscovered in the last few decades and are now using it as just a wonderful attraction here in Sioux Falls. But thinking about what are the underutilized assets, the places oftentimes you see as problems that could be real opportunities to do community work. So this is where I love to work sometimes in the neighborhoods that are the most distressed, because they have places that are really great opportunities to see things in different ways, to see that vacant lot as a potential for a community garden rather than just complaining about the vacant lot, to see the graffiti covered wall as a potential canvas for a mural, to see that vacant building as a potential for a community center of some kind. You know, it's about thinking about things in different ways, using that underutilized grassy area to create bring back the natural prairie. All kinds of things you can do with the underutilized resources. Seeing your neighborhood, rather than seeing them as problems, see them as opportunities. So some examples. This is in the Hillman City neighborhood in Seattle, where they had a vacant building. And neighbors came together to create what they call a co-laboratory. And they renovated this building themselves, all with volunteer labor. It's now used by 28 different associations in the neighborhood that have come together to utilize this space. It's almost like a community living room, so it's a great place to hang out, to have community gatherings. They have an art gallery here where local artists display their art. They have a little library here that's maintained by the community. It's a place for performances at night, so it brings the community together for concerts, for drama, for poetry readings. There's an area that's a child care center where parents are taking turns watching each other's children, and lots of equipment to keep the kids entertained. There's co-working space where groups can get together and collaborate on projects. They put together a community kitchen so that they can have community meals together. And they train the kids in the neighborhood how to be chefs. And the vacant lot behind became a community garden, so they grow their own produce to serve in the local kitchen. Have barbecues at night. And it's just been a fantastic way to build community in a place that used to be a problem. It reminded me a little bit of the bakery that was here when I last visited 7 years ago, in that co-working space. I understand they had to move out. But it was a very cool project here in Sioux Falls. Right. No, that was a huge obstacle with creating the community school. We worked at that for quite a while to make that happen because the school district raised all those concerns, which are very legitimate. It was teachers concerned their things might be put back in the right place. It was the legal department talking about the whole liability issue. It was what about the increased costs for the electricity at night, for the heating the building at night. What about wear and tear on the facility? All the reasons why it wouldn't work. So we worked with them to figure out how we cover those. Some of that's covered through nonprofit organizations having the insurance to cover the community schools liability. Some of it was about just being hearing what the teachers' concerns were and making sure things were put back. It took a long time. We also worked out an agreement between our city and the school district to recognize that the city had facilities that the school district needed, and the school district had facilities that the city needed. So it just traded those facilities back and forth. So it's making the swimming pools available to the city's swimming pools to the school district, making the baseball fields and the gymnasiums available to the city so that they could be open at night. And just swapping and realizing that generally it's an even swap where we're taking on each other's liability, where we're taking on each other's operating costs, but in overall we're saving money for both organizations because we don't have to build extra facilities. But you raise a good point. That's often what stops projects is people thinking about what are all the reasons why we can't do it rather than how can we go about doing it. We had a church that was underutilized in the White Center neighborhood. and the neighbors came together and asked the church, could we utilize the church? And this church was falling down. It was, they just didn't have a small congregation, didn't have the money to keep it up. The neighbors came together and renovated that church themselves. I mean, did a spectacular job. Replaced all the windows, replaced the siding, totally renovated the space. And now it's used by the community as well as by the church. They have a community daycare program there. They have concerts there. They have tutoring programs there. And the church has really increased in membership. It's a benefit not just to the community, but to the institution to collaborate. Here's another example about using underutilized resources in the neighborhood, and this gets to your point about those old grassy areas. So this is I don't know what you call that area between the sidewalk and the street, the parking strip. Yeah, everybody's got different names: median, parking strip, whatever. And people often resent it because it's owned by the property owner, but the city requires them to. It's owned by the property owner. It's owned the opposite. It's owned by the city, but they require the property owner to keep it up, and you keep it up in a certain way. And it's just grass, and it's too small to really be good for anything. And so people kind of resent it. Well, this woman in the central area of Seattle had this idea, and without asking any permission from the city, she tore up all the grass and put in native plants and created pollinator plants that would support butterflies and hummingbirds and bees. And her neighbors saw this, and they got excited about the idea. And they said, could you help us do the same thing in our front yards, in our medians? And so all the neighbors came together, and they started tearing up all these planting strips and putting in native plants and pollinators. And they eventually created a 1-mile-long pollinator pathway that connects all of the front yards together. And it really works. I mean, look at how it builds community, how people from all ages got involved in this project. And it works. The bees are there. And that became a model that then adjacent streets started utilizing. And it just brought a lot more beauty into the neighborhood. It connected the neighbors. Again, just an example, a small example about underutilized resources in the community. So just like you to think about what are the physical resources in your neighborhood that are underutilized. We're a little behind time, so I think I'll keep moving. But think about that, okay? Fifth thing is in every community is the culture, history, and identity. What's special about your neighborhood? Particularly neighborhoods that are having problems often get defined by people outside the neighborhood, right? I know I lived in southeast Seattle, and we were proud of our neighborhood, but the city always defined it as the South End. And it was always like the headlines, there was another killing in the South End. Well, the South End was everything south of downtown Seattle, which is a huge area. So the murder might have been way out in the suburbs, but somehow everybody always thought of it as my neighborhood, right? So oftentimes our neighborhoods get defined in very negative terms by people outside our community, by the media or whoever, as a poor neighborhood, disadvantaged neighborhood, all of which has some truth. But again, it's that map of the deficits. So it's really important for communities to define themselves, to take pride in their community, to think, what's special about our neighborhood? What do we want to celebrate? What do we want to take pride? Because it's that hope, it's that sense of pride that will get people engaged. They're going to get engaged if they say, this is a dump, right? So whether you have a really nice neighborhood or a rundown neighborhood, it's really important to create an identity, so that people feel like they have something in common. Sometimes that identity is pretty evident because you have a series of historic homes like you do, which is really special. You can say, it's really clear when you're in a particular neighborhood, but other neighborhoods need to create that identity. And it might be around a physical, something in your neighborhood. It might be an historic building. It might be a wonderful natural resource. It might be a park. It might be a school. But what's special about your neighborhood? What do you want to celebrate? What do you want to, help? What do you want to elevate to help people identify with your community in a very positive way? just some small towns. This is Roswell, New Mexico, and they try to figure out what's special about our place. Well, it was the place where they identified a UFO in 1948, and apparently it crashed in Roswell. So now they celebrate, this is the Center for UFOs in the United States, UFO crash site, but they just create sculptures that celebrate the UFOs. They have a UFO museum that has the sightings from all around the world of UFOs and has displays like this. But they just have fun with it as well. And it just brings all kinds of people to Roswell. Even the McDonald's. This is in Vulcan, Alberta, where they didn't have any UFOs, but they had a cool name. So they said, let's play with the Vulcan idea. And they have a whole Star Trek thing going on there. This is their visitor center. So think about what's special about your neighborhood. What does it want to highlight? Is it the history of your community that's really special? Is it a particular physical? You know, when we went through the neighborhoods the other day, we saw some neighborhoods that had wonderful signage up to identify the neighborhood. That's a great way to kind of create that neighborhood identity. It might be, you know, like in Fremont neighborhood of Seattle, I think yesterday I showed the troll. And they just like to think of themselves as a weird place. So they're just doing weird stuff all the time. They have, you know, the big parade every year with summer solstice led by naked bicyclists. They have this big statue of Lenin that they got from the Soviet Union in the town square. They're just weird, you know. So thinking about what's special or what can you do in your place that would be really make your neighborhood stand out, make people have a sense of pride. Sixth asset that's in every community is the local economy. And the point here is that every neighborhood, even neighborhoods that we often think of as low income, have an economy. It's just in some places it's a smaller economy than other places. And the problem is, particularly in lower income neighborhoods, that what little money is there is often flowing out. It's called the leaky bucket model of economic development, where the money might all be going out to providers of services to low-income people who live outside the neighborhood. Or people are buying all their, there's no local businesses, so they're buying everything from Amazon and supporting the Seattle economy instead of their own neighborhood economy, right? So it's about how do we minimize the imports into the neighborhood, and how do we really build around the strengths of our community? So in Columbia City, all of our businesses had become boarded up over time, and we'd lost our business due to drug trafficking, gang activity, and so we tried to figure out how do we revive our local economy, and artists really played a key role. They created murals on the outside of all these boarded up businesses to show the kind of businesses they'd like to see in the neighborhood, to make the place look alive. And it wasn't long before we had to take down every one of the murals because real businesses wanted to move in. This is a really abbreviated version of the story, but they did all kinds of things. They started up a farmer's market on a vacant parking lot where the supermarket had moved out. Started up concerts in the local cafes to get people to feel comfortable coming back into the business district. Started up a bicycle recycle business in the neighborhood to support young people to help learn skills in fixing bikes, to provide bikes to people in the neighborhood. All kinds of actions that the community took to revive the business district. This is in Beacon Hill, where they worked to create little food carts for new immigrants into the community so that they could start up businesses. And once they're, if it's build up their skills, their clientele, then a lot of them move into real storefronts and start up cafes. But it's a great way to get incubator businesses going in the neighborhood. A lot of places have local currency that they create their own money for the neighborhood or for the city. This is in Calgary, where I got to speak at the unveiling of millions of dollars of Calgary dollars. And of course, no other city recognizes Calgary dollars, so you have to spend your money locally, which really supports local businesses. They do the same thing in Toronto and Salt Spring Islands. Lots of artists, they're always creating new denominations of money, and oftentimes tourists take that money and they take it home as souvenirs, but all the value stays on the island. So they use that value to support local food banks and local services. Time banks are another great way to support the local economy, which in a way that's non-monetary. It's just about people sharing their resources with each other. Whew. So that's just, sorry, that was very quick, but it's 6 different kinds of resources that are in your neighborhood that I think are often underutilized. So I really hope you'll think about what are all those resources we could use to take our neighborhood work to a different level. Okay, we're going to move on to placemaking. And I'd like to start by just clarifying some terms so we're all on the same page. And the first one is just talking about the difference between community and neighborhood, because oftentimes we use those words interchangeably, right? Talk about my neighborhood, my community means the same thing. I like to think that they're different. So community is really about our social relationships. Community is a group of people who identify with and support one another. So there's all kinds of communities. They aren't just neighborhood communities. There are communities of interest where people have maybe similar hobbies. There's communities of identity where people identify as seniors or as a particular race or culture or religion or politics or profession. So there's many different kinds of communities. Neighborhood is the place with which we identify. And that's why I was having a hard time when you talked about scale, because it's different in different places. It's about sort of the natural place where you come together. In Seattle, we tend to organize neighborhoods around business districts that are kind of the center for that neighborhood, because it's kind of the gathering place. In other places, it might be around the school. You don't want to create artificial boundaries. Some cities say we want every neighborhood to be the same, so they create neighborhoods that have exactly 1,000 people in each one. But then it creates artificial divisions, and you want to where people already have sort of a sense of place, where what's distinctive about that place. But I think in many ways the wonderful thing about neighborhoods is I think it is the best place to build community. You can do community in a way that no other kind of community is possible. And here's some of the key ingredients for building community and why I think neighborhoods provide the best opportunity to build community. First, if you want to build community, you need to have a common identity, something that brings you together. And in a lot of ways, that place gives everybody a sense of being part of a whole. Manageable scale. There's no way you can build a sense of community in Sioux Falls. It's way too big. No way you can feel connected with everybody. But it's at the neighborhood level where you just have maybe 1,000 or a few thousand people where you can really get connected with one another and with the different networks in the community. Third thing that's critical for building community is something I've already talked about a little bit, which is the bumping places, places where you can build relationships. And the closer those places are to where you live, the more likely you are to bump into the same people over and over again. So again, those local places are the best place to build community. Fourth, there are opportunities for collective action, ways for people to do things as a community that they can't do individually. And I find that the closer you involve people to where they live, as I mentioned before, the more likely they are to get engaged. I think the thing that's one of the most powerful things about place-based communities is the opportunity to bring people together who are different. Every other kind of community is one kind of people, people with a particular interest or people with a particular identity. So you just get the old people or you just get the young people, or you just get the Latino community, or you just get the Lutheran community, or you just get the Republican community, or the Democratic community. In neighborhoods is the one kind of community where you can bring diverse people together. Where in a neighborhood, you have people of different incomes. You have people of different ages. You have people with different sexual orientations. You have people with different politics. You have people with different interests. And that's the kind of community we need a lot more of these days because we've become so polarized. And neighborhoods is the chance to build relationships across differences. But it's not easy. And the final one is opportunities for placemaking. And again, it's only neighborhood-based communities that are involved in placemaking because you all have a place in common. Other kinds of communities are not connected to a place. So I want to talk about placemaking because I think it's the opportunity for communities to shape places that work for them. And in turn, that place helps create a stronger sense of community. So I want to talk about how that can happen. Placemaking involves neighbors working together to shape common spaces in ways that contribute to building and sustaining a strong community and a vibrant neighborhood. Placemaking provides 4 key ingredients for building community. And the first one is it just provides all kinds of opportunities for lots of participation to build on all the gifts that are in community. So here's an example. This is in Toppenish, Washington, kind of a rural community, a small town, a largely Latino community, farm workers, but in the middle of the Yakima Nation, which is a Native American reservation. And they were complaining that their local park, Lincoln Park, had been taken over by the gangs. They had destroyed all the playground equipment. There was graffiti all over the park. And the neighbor said, what can we do to rebuild the park? Well, I was teaching a course at the time in landscape architecture at the University of Washington. So I went out with my students and we listened to the community. And they said, we want to rebuild this park as a community. So we thought, how can we put together a plan for this park? We thought, well, we should check with the primary users, which are the kids. So we went to the local school and we asked the principal, can we have some access to some of your kids? And we had this room full of third graders. It was wild. It was just all kinds of energy pent up. But we asked them to think about what's special about your culture and about your place that you'd like to reflect in the park. What would you like to see happen in the park? So the kids drew pictures of what they wanted to see in the park. And then we invited their parents and the larger community to come to a session at the local church on a Saturday morning to look at the kids' artwork. And we had a huge turnout because who can say no to their kids? They say, Mom and Dad, please come see my artwork. So it's a great way. If you can get the kids involved, oftentimes the parents will get involved as well. And then we had the parents put their dots on their favorite themes and images from their kids' artwork. And we used that as the basis for my landscape architecture students to put together a design plan for the park. And here's one of my students presenting the proposed plan back to the community members. And about a third of this park plan had an agricultural theme because this is an agricultural area and a lot of the kids' images showed things from agriculture. So there was a community orchard, community garden, barbecue pit to cook food. About a third of the park was a traditional sort of Mexican plaza with a kiosco, with the fountains, with a tile work, and about a third of it was a fantasy playground because I think kids everywhere read Harry Potter. So there were castles and there were dragons, and so my students presented this back to the community and they loved it because it was their own ideas that had been incorporated by the students. But they also had criticisms. They said, you don't have any way for we have a big fiesta every year, and there's no way for the flatbed trucks to get into the park, so we need to create more of an opening. You have a formal entranceway into the park, and we just live around the park. We'd like to come from our own homes rather than have to go all the way around the block in order to get into the park. So it's really good for my students to understand the importance of listening to the community's knowledge and the community's expertise and combining the two. I had landscape architecture students who could take those ideas and create a really refined plan, because you need those professionals as well, but building on the best of both. So we tried, what they really wanted, what the kids were most excited about, was building a dragon in the park. So we said, we got to get started. Let's start with a dragon. Well, I had all these landscape architecture students who knew about landscape architecture but didn't know how to build anything. So I had social work students who went out to the neighborhood to do a gift inventory to find out what were the skills of the residents. Turns out a lot of the residents knew how to build straw bale houses. Do you know that technology? Using that sort of waste product, and it really provides good insulation because it gets really cold there in the winter, really hot there in the summer. So I said, we got to build a straw bale dragon, because that's what the kids want. So we had all these straw bales come in from the countryside, and I had my students, I went there with my students, we were living in a teepee in the Yakima reservation. I thought it was going to be a one-weekend project, but when all these straw bales came, I thought, we're going to be here all summer. It was just kind of overwhelming. But when the neighbors saw us starting to build this, they came out of their homes to help. And we had this huge turnout, so they were all using their skills to help build the straw bale dragon. And we covered it with tar paper and with chicken wire. And here he is kind of snaking through the grass. And then we had a color contest, and we let kids vote for what color they wanted to paint the straw bale dragon. And they painted for Smurf blue. And the kids did a penny drive to raise money for all the materials. And one penny at a time, they raised $1,200, which was enough to pay for this dragon. And so as a tribute to the kids, we built the pennies into the eyes and into the, with mane or whatever that is of the dragon. And the kids put their handprints all over it to show a sign of ownership. And here's the completed dragon. And nobody messes with that dragon because the community feels ownership. And it's an example about how those kind of projects can engage everybody's gifts. The kids in the school, the people who had the construction skills, the people just had some time to participate. And they went on from that to build community gardens. They went on from that to build a playground structure. They went on from that. Last time I was there was a band playing in the park, and families were out there eating dinner together. And they watch out for that park now because they feel a sense of ownership. Nobody messes with that dragon, right? Second key for placemaking is placemaking creates a shared identities that builds on the local history, culture, and or physical attributes of the place. So it's about community rather than having developers come in and just creating places that look the same every place you go. It's about communities figuring out what's special about our place and what identity can we create that makes people really proud. This is in Edmonton, Alberta, 118th Avenue, where they're having a huge issue in their business district there with prostitution and drug dealing, all kinds of problems. And most of the businesses had been boarded up. The police were coming out all the time. That's where they were spending their time. The city's solution was this neighborhood is on 118th, which links to stadiums. So they said, stadiums, that's sort of the theme of the neighborhood. We're going to create a sports theme for the neighborhood to try to give a new identity, make people feel positive about the neighborhood. And so they put up a welcome avenue, they call it the Avenue of Champions, and they hung hockey players and things from the light poles. They put up a gigantic bat, which is kind of the entranceway to the neighborhood, but it didn't change any of what happened in the neighborhood. The neighbors weren't happy about this, and some of the artists actually fabricated a gigantic condom that they put over the bat to show there was still a problem with prostitution in the neighborhood. So the neighbors tried to figure out what's special about our place and what can we do. Well, they said we have a lot of artists. So they created an art festival on a vacant lot there in the neighborhood and had a good turnout where people started feeling, hey, maybe we can bring back community activity here and not feel scared. You know, people were just afraid to go out of their homes. But if we can come out collectively and do things together, maybe we can take back our neighborhood. There was an old abandoned, one of the storefronts was closed, and the community came together and said, how about if we start up a community coffee house? And they call it the Carrot. It's been incredibly successful. They renovate it themselves. Neighbors take turns being the baristas. They make baked goods. But it's just become the bumping place, the gathering place, and started to bring people together because they had a reason to go to the business district, a legitimate reason to go to the business district. And they have performances by local musicians at night. They have an art gallery in there. So it just created this, started to create this sense of community built on what was special about the neighborhood, all of the artists and musicians in the community. Well, then they started branching out and said, we need more space. So they started up what they call the Kaleidoscope Festival, and they closed down 118th Avenue, and it just becomes a huge festival for the arts. So here they are with tables set up outside, belly dancer performances, all kinds of art being performed, lots of visual art, people dancing on the sides of buildings, different cultures, musicians playing from the top of the storefront, having outdoor movies. That was, and you know, it became so successful. Now people come from all over Alberta to come there. It's a huge arts festival. This place where even the neighbors were afraid to come to is now a major gathering space and help revitalize the businesses. Of course, in Edmonton, they also have a huge problem in the winter. It's pretty cold, and it's hard to come together as a community. So they started up, they said, let's celebrate winter. And they put together a deep freeze festival. And again, building on the arts, building on, you know, celebrating the cold. And they put a hockey rink right in the middle of the street. They have sledding. They have freezer box races where they get in and go down the hill. They have fire pits. They have snow sculptures, ice sculptures. So it just became a place to celebrate what's special about us. It's the arts. They created a building with a center for people with disabilities, and downstairs they have huge artist facilities where they're working with people with disabilities to create art. And upstairs is co-op housing for artists, so that artists can stay in permanently affordable housing, because oftentimes the artists who help rejuvenate neighborhoods are the first ones who get forced out of the neighborhood because they can't afford it with gentrification. So they have permanently affordable housing. Here's some of what goes on in that in the studio space. And here's a mural that says, we believe in 118th. So it's just this inspiring story about what's possible when you define the community yourselves and build on the strengths of your community. Third, placemaking results in more refreshed and better utilized bumping spaces. So this is in St. Kilda, Australia, where they had an old lawn bowling club. They had lawn bowling clubs all over Australia, but it's largely older people. And as they died off, the lawn bowling wasn't used anymore. So they had this huge lawn bowling area. And some of the neighbors said, you know, let's revitalize that space. Let's use it as a community gathering space. What would you like to see happen? And they decided they put in a community garden. They call it Veg Out Community Garden. So this is the entranceway in. And they still kept some of the old things from the lawn bowling. So here's the St. Kilda. And I love this. They put in a tombstone here, and it says, rest in peace. I forget what it says here. Old bowlers never die, they just get composted. But they just had fun, and they figured out how to use all the community resources to create a really fantastic community gathering space where everybody would feel comfortable. It's right next to Luna Park, where they have carnival rides. But they created a food forest out of fruit trees. They have a desert forest. They had the old lawn bowling club that is now an artist studio. And you can see they have the yellow submarine up on the roof. But the artists work with other community members to create wonderful art. And there's just art all over the place. Here's a mural that was made by community members for Veg Out. It's just fun to walk around this place, just so much creativity. This is part of their irrigation system, and the udders of the cow are used to irrigate the pea patch. But they really tried to make it inviting so everybody felt comfortable there and had a role in it. So here's a sign just pointing to all the things happening in this garden. They have a children's play area in the garden, hopscotch. They have a petting zoo. When I was there, they were doing face painting for kids. They have this sculpture that you can crank, and the kids just love it, with moving parts in it made by local artists. Fairy garden. They have a performance stage. When I was there, they were having a concert for the kids. They have a place where they make food. They've got a pizza oven. So they have a cafe, serve meals to people. They even have a little pub there. And this is all in the community garden. So it just brings people with all kinds of different interests together in a space. Here's all the families gathering around. So that to me is the most important thing, is how do you create spaces where everybody feels included and really builds on what's special about that place and helps people bump into people who are different than themselves. Here's all kinds of other bumping that can happen. This is a park created by neighbors in Ballard, and they celebrate the house that used to stand there by creating a living room furniture made out of concrete. Bumping in front yards. Instead of barbecuing the backyards in Tacoma, they started barbecuing their front yards to encourage neighbors to stop by and connect. This is in Tacoma again, where they were having a huge problem with drug dealing. So they said, let's take back the neighborhood, and they just all the cement around that area. They do chalk drawings, and they get together every Friday and create chalk drawings. And of course, it rains a lot in Tacoma, so they wash and they have a fresh canvas every Friday. And during the week, people come and look at the art. So it's been a great way to kind of create more bumping happening on the sidewalks. This is where they capture rainwater off the side of the building, and it goes into cisterns. And they have seating area. This is called, it's sort of like the hand of Michelangelo reaching out and capturing water off the side of the building. Bumping in streets, trying to slow down traffic so we can make it more pedestrian friendly, create bicycle laneways for families to ride their bicycles. Bumping on former parking lots. So this is a parking lot that was right on the waterway in New Zealand, and the community renovated it to become a park. This is a parking garage in Seattle, at Seattle Center, that wasn't fully utilized all the time. So they created the top floor of the parking garage is now a community garden. Bumping in vacant lots. This is in Christchurch after the earthquakes. They had vacant lots all over the place, trying to figure out how do we recreate community? How do we bring people together? Had some really ingenious ideas. Here was a vacant lot. Somebody had an old washing machine, and they hooked it up to an iPod. So if you put in a couple quarters, you can play whatever dance music you want. And they created a dance floor, and so now people on this vacant lot are dancing together right after the earthquake. This is another vacant lot in Christchurch where they put a movie screen up, and you ride up in your bicycle and you hook it up to a generator, and as long as you're biking, the movie plays. So it's just a great way for people to get exercise and to do this together. Just a lot of creativity can come out of community. This East Lake neighborhood of Seattle, under the freeway, was good for nothing except holding up the freeway. But this high ceiling and spaces, and the kids went under there and said, this could be the perfect place for something we've always wanted, but haven't been able to find space for. And they created a BMX track. Just perfect. It's always sheltered from the rain, underutilized space, a place where there was a lot of public safety problems, but now it's always being utilized, so we don't have the public safety issues. There are some liability issues, but... So somebody asked about what Department of Neighborhoods does about neighborhood planning. So I wanted to give an example of a neighborhood plan and how neighbors came together to kind of reshape their whole neighborhood. I shared this one with the city yesterday. But this is the Delridge neighborhood of Seattle. I talked about how most of our neighborhoods are built around business districts. This particular neighborhood was built around an arterial, which is a way to get somewhere else, to White Center. So it was very auto-oriented. Lots of convenience stores, gas stations, no real bumping space. The only bumping that happened was cars, right? Very low-income neighborhood, largely renters, a lot of apartment buildings, largely immigrant community. But because it was largely underdeveloped, it had the best natural environment of any neighborhood in Seattle. A third of the city's green belts were there. Longfellow Creek, which is the longest contiguous creek in Seattle, is in the Delridge neighborhood. But as developers ran out of room in the other neighborhoods in Seattle, they discovered Delridge. And we got some of the worst possible development, where we got this big box retail built right on top of the creek. And here's a sign saying development's coming, and they were losing their green belts to development. And really some very ugly development where all you saw were garage doors instead of front doors. Still very auto-oriented. This is Vivian McLean. She was a lifelong resident of Delridge. She'd been a school teacher. She'd retired. She was sick about what was happening to her neighborhood. There were no neighborhood associations. This is a community of about 30,000 people. And she said, well, that's too big to have a neighborhood association. So she single-handedly organized a dozen neighborhood associations all through Delridge, helping people connect with each other. And then all these associations worked together as one Delridge community to fight bad development. And they were largely successful at keeping development away from the creek and preserving the best of the green belts. But Vivian said, you know, I'm so tired of putting all my energy into keeping our neighborhood from becoming a worse place. I'd like to make it a better place. And so she worked with neighbors to create a community development corporation so that they would have some capacity to do development themselves. And the first thing they did was to apply to us to do a neighborhood plan. And they pulled all the different interests in the neighborhood together, and together they created a vision for their neighborhood. And their vision was, we want to create a center to our neighborhood like every other neighborhood has. We want to get the kind of public facilities that other neighborhoods have, but we haven't had because we haven't had a voice with the city. We want to preserve our natural environment. And as we make a better neighborhood, we want to keep it affordable. We don't want to create a better neighborhood for somebody else. We want to create a better neighborhood for the low-income, multicultural community that lives here. That was their vision, and here's what they did. Because so many people were involved in the planning process, they felt ownership of the plan, and they took responsibility for making a lot of it happen themselves. Volunteers revegetated along the creek to take out the invasive plants and revegetate with native plants. They created a trail system along the creek to connect people with nature and to connect these different neighborhoods with one another, including this wonderful fishbone bridge that spans the creek. Get out of the way of the pictures. They worked with low-income residents in public housing to create community gardens, including market gardens where they could sell the produce to make some income. Then in the center of the neighborhood at Delridge and Brandon, which is just a vacant lot, they said this is going to be our neighborhood center. And they built a 3-story mixed-use development. The scale was unlike anything else in that neighborhood. And the first floor, they made retail space so they could have bumping space. Upstairs, they put in condos affordable to first-time home buyers so that low-income families could have housing, permanently affordable housing. And they created a court in the center to create a bumping space for these families so that they could build a sense of community within that complex. Then they lobbied the city and said, we want a library like every other neighborhood. We've got the highest percentage of kids of any neighborhood in Seattle, but we don't have a library. And because it involved so many people in the planning process, they had an army, and they were able to get the city to agree to put up the money for the library. Before the city even had a chance, the community came together, worked with a local architect to design the library themselves, invited the city out and said, this is what our library is going to look like, and this is where we want it as part of our neighborhood center. So this is what they built, a library with 28 units of low-income housing up above it. This is something that would never come out of our city government because our library just builds libraries and our housing department just builds housing. It's in community that we tend to get more comprehensive solutions. They went on to, there was a 12-acre green belt that was threatened with development. The neighborhood sold half the acreage back to the Parks Department to preserve as green space, but the other half showed we want to show that development can be compatible with the environment. So they built a very green development where the units face each other. It's kind of like co-housing, and where they have a common house, where they do joint childcare, where they have a computer center. But the families just feel so privileged to live in this beautiful place surrounded by the woods. They had an old food bank where it was just a rundown building on a major arterial where people were standing outside in the rain, waiting in line to get food in front of all the neighbors, not feeling like a real sense of pride. So they said, we want to treat our families with respect. We're going to build a new food bank. And they built a food bank, again, with 28 units of low-income housing up above it. And it's not just a food bank, but they do job training programs to help people escape dependence on emergency services, and lots of support. They have a courtyard in the center to create a community gathering place. And then they had this old school, Cooper Elementary School, built in 1917. It was the home of the first African-American school teacher in Seattle, an historic site, but it had been closed and boarded up for 17 years. Kind of the gateway to the neighborhood, sort of a sign of neglect and disinvestment. And the community said, we want to make this our pride and joy again. So they had a visioning session about how to reuse the school, and their vision was, we want to create a multicultural center, surround our young people with the arts, and to celebrate what's special about our community. With this project and with the others, the community raised $30 million. Starting with each person in the community giving what they could. The first person who donated was a high school student who was on the board of the Community Development Corporation. She donated all of her summer earnings, $1,000, to support these projects. And when the other board members saw her step up, they did the same themselves and gave everything they could. And then when they'd raised $120,000 out of the board, they went to the local bank, they went to the corporations, they went to the foundations and said, we have stretched as much as we possibly can to support this project. We expect you to do the same. And these outside funders were eager to support this project because it wasn't just a development officer from a nonprofit organization asking for the money. It was the community that had put in their own blood, sweat, and tears to make this project happen. And so they were able to raise the $30 million to do these projects. So they turned this old school building into the Youngstown Cultural Arts Center. They invited in the Interagency Academy for Youth, which is a school for kids who've been kicked out of every other school in Seattle, and brought them into this building to surround them with the arts and to help them be successful. They fixed up the old gymnasium as a state-of-the-art movement studio. The old cafeteria became a theater, and the classrooms up above became 28 units for live workspace for low-income artists who helped program the space down below with the young people, but permanently affordable housing. So when we had the open house, the opening of this, 3,000 people showed up because they all felt ownership. It was their idea. They'd raised the money. It was their kids who were performing. it was their community. So here's what I see as the benefits of placemaking. It builds on local knowledge, character, and culture. What's special about that place? Rather than just an outside developer or city kind of creating cookie cutter places that all look the same, it was about what's special about our place. Multiplies available resources. So you could see it was, yeah, we utilized government resources, but it was also tapping into what communities could do best. Results in more holistic and creative places, like the housing above the library. Creates ownership that leads to less vandalism and greater maintenance, programming, and use by the community. I see this all the time. When communities build spaces, they take care of them. They actively utilize them. I've seen a lot of cities where they say, oh, community gardening programs are great. We're going to go out and build community gardens. So the government builds the garden, and then they wonder why people don't maintain them or take care of them. It's because they're the city's gardens. They aren't the communities, right? Builds a stronger sense of community as people develop a common identity and collectively shape and use the space. So here's some things to consider when placemaking. One is to start with a vision for the neighborhood. I'm going to talk about visioning in a little bit, but having people come together to create a common vision about where do you want to go as the community. So we aren't doing these placemaking projects as one-off projects, but so that they're building towards something bigger. What's the overall theme? What's the identity of our community? What are we trying to achieve? Strive for inclusion through placemaking. As I talked about, community in itself isn't necessarily a good. We have communities that we call gangs. We have communities of Nazis, right? Communities, I think, only valuable if we bring different people together. Create inclusive places. So one of the challenges, I think, in our community work is oftentimes our associations are just one kind of people. And oftentimes our bumping places are only one kind of people. So how do we really create inclusive placemaking? One is to engage all parts of the community in the processes of designing, building, and programming. So from the very start, who makes up our community, and make sure that they're part of the design process so that it takes in their needs, what's important about their community, they're part of the community. To build on use everybody's gifts in building that project and then in programming it, so everybody feels some ownership of it. Create bumping places that support a broad range of activities. Talked about the power of 10. If signage and art are involved, incorporate the languages and cultures of the community so everybody can see themselves in that project. Make bumping spaces accessible to those with differing abilities and incomes. So I see one of the problems we're having is increasingly in our bumping places, you can only go if you have money, right? So trying to create spaces where everybody feels welcome and included. Develop multi-use facilities in neighborhoods. This is in our international district in Seattle, where out of the neighborhood plan, they said we want to create a village on our block. So they came up with this project where they got the city to build a library and a community center with low-income housing above it for families. And it's so fantastic because people have the opportunity to, they got a library in their place, they got the community center, a huge living room, they've got restaurants, they've got retail in the space, and across the street, I don't have that, but across the street is housing for seniors and a daycare center, and they interact, the seniors and the daycare center interact. There's a health center there. There's other human services. But so people can get everything they need right in that block. And I think that's so important. I think it used to be, especially in the small towns, we'd live, learn, work, and play all in the same place. And that's how you develop really deep connections with each other. And now in our society, we've created single-purpose places, bedroom communities where we just go to sleep, right? And we might go across the city to do shopping in the mall. We might go across the city to the large community center to do our recreation. We might have to commute an hour to work, So how can we make more multi-use in our neighborhoods? without destroying the character of our neighborhoods, right? Don't surrender bumping places to fear. So I see this happening more and more, that the wrong people are hanging out in our parks, so we put a curfew on the park. The wrong people are hanging out on the bench, so we take the bench out. And it's not a solution. The crime continues, the problems continue, and we've lost the bumping place. Increasingly, we're losing our bumping places to fears around crime. Saw what they did in 118th Avenue. Instead of surrendering to crime, they said, let's take back our neighborhood and let's activate it through the arts. This is in the Surrey neighborhood. This is underneath the transit. And underneath there was a bench so people could sit and wait for the transit. Well, the wrong people were hanging out on the bench. And the police saw it as a public safety problem, so the city put a fence around the bench to keep out the problem. And the community said, this is kind of dumb. So they started a Free the Bench campaign. And they just had, I should have brought the photos, but they just did crazy things. They said, this bench looks lonely. So they started bringing chairs inside to give it company. And they started dressing up the bench to make it look like a dragon. And they started hanging origami cranes in there and just decorating it. And at Christmas time, the bench was still there, so they put in a Christmas tree. And they put in and they made it a living room at one point. And they had a television set in there in front of the bench. And they just had a great time kind of making fun of this. And finally, with this Free the Bench campaign, the city said, okay, they'll take it down. And now they have benches up and down the streets of Surrey because they realize that's how people connect. It's not about how do we keep people out, it's how do we bring people in. You know, if you can really create a sense of community, a sense of ownership of that space, you may still have people there who people consider undesirable, but it's part of the community, right? It's how do we bring everybody together? People are less likely to act out, and people are going to feel a lot more comfortable if there is a large community presence. Oh yeah, here's a Free the Bench t-shirt. And this is the tough one. Anticipate gentrification. I've just seen this over and over and over again, that we work so hard, particularly in neighborhoods that are a little tough, that are having issues. The last thing to think about is that we're going to gentrify. You know, just so desperate for change. But that is the time to think about how do we deal with gentrification, to come up with some strategies for keeping the place permanently affordable while the land is still somewhat affordable. We usually wake up to gentrification when it's too late and everybody's been priced out. It's pretty hard to deal with gentrification at that point. So here's some strategies that some people have used to deal with gentrification. And there's no magic solution. One is to organize a community development corporation like they did in Delridge, to just have the capacity for the community to do its own development. Another one is to develop a land bank or community land trust while real estate is still affordable. So you know, the way a community land trust works is the community owns the land and the property owner owns the house. So when they sell the house, they realize limited equity from the sale of that house because a lot of the value is still in the land. But it keeps the housing permanently affordable over time. So, you know, buying up those properties while they're still somewhat affordable is a good strategy. Establish a home sharing program. A lot of people, particularly as they age, got a single person living in a huge house, and doing a home sharing program where you might have young person living in there who can't afford the rent otherwise or can't afford to buy a house, is living in that house in home sharing agreement, helping to support that elder, and the elder is helping the young person with housing. So it can be a great match. Consider allowing accessory dwelling units, cottage housing in big backyards, things, you know, where your kids might not be able to afford housing or your parents can't afford it, to have housing options and create more housing opportunities in your neighborhood. Advocate for inclusionary zoning, where developers are required to make a certain percentage of the new housing units available to making them permanently affordable. Initiate micro-lending, incubators, and cooperatives to help residents start their own businesses, because businesses often get gentrified as well. Small businesses get knocked out of neighborhoods. Look for ways in which neighbors could benefit from a more robust local economy. So the point isn't how do we should see economic progress as a good thing, and how do we get the neighbors to benefit from that? The goal isn't how do we keep poor people in our neighborhood. The goal should be how do we help everybody benefit from improved neighborhood. And then seek community benefit agreements with developers. So a lot of communities that have fought development have sat down with developers and say, here's things you could do that would make us more comfortable with your development, whether that is design standards that make the development fit with the neighborhood, commitments to hire local people in development of those projects as construction workers so local people can get jobs, commitments to that the new retail space in the place will provide living wage jobs. So just thinking about what's important to the community and how could you work with the developer so that it works for both the developer and the community. More discussion, answer questions. So one of the keys is how do we move from vision to action? How do we put all this together? And here's an activity I love to do, and I was hoping to have time to do it today. I don't think we have time. We probably don't have enough people from each neighborhood to do it. But here's something I'd love for you to think about doing when you go back to your neighborhood. I think it's a great way to bring people together. And that is to do some visioning. When I was in New Zealand, there was an artist who'd created this mural, and I just love the saying that he uses. When we dream alone, it's only a dream. But when many dream together, it is the beginning of a new reality. Right? So it's about how do we create a shared vision for our community. I was in the Netherlands in a community where I was with a neighborhood leader, and she showed me this beautiful community orchard they made. I said, what made this possible? She said, well, this had always been my dream, but what made this possible when it became everybody's dream. Right? So so here's a way to help create a common vision. I worked with senior services at King County that came to me because they were concerned that the population is quickly aging and the resources were declining. So they said, how do we keep up? How do we serve an increasingly aging population? And the idea became, how do we build on the strengths of the seniors? And so we put together a program we called Aging Your Way. And the idea was to bring seniors together to create what's their vision, rather than just senior services assuming what people needed, to help seniors create their own vision for what was needed. And so we had gatherings all over King County, 15 different gatherings in suburban communities, in cities, in neighborhoods, and brought about 100 people together in each one. And I put people through an exercise. Denise Klein, who was head of senior services, asked people, close your eyes and think about when you were first old. And what do you need? And how are you contributing to your community? And how are you fitting into your neighborhood? And so here people are contemplating that question. I love this woman's expression. She's not quite sure she wants to go there. And then when people were in that frame of mind, I asked them to have a discussion around their table about what would a senior-friendly community look like? What would allow you to age in the way you would like? And gave them 20 minutes to collectively draw their vision for a senior-friendly community where they lived. And so here people are collectively drawing their vision. And then I asked each table to share their vision with the room as a whole. And it was amazing how similar a lot of the visions were. They wanted to create opportunities to interact with young people and not just be in their senior silo. They wanted to create walkable spaces where they could still get around the neighborhood, where they could walk to destinations in their community, have 15-minute neighborhoods. They wanted opportunities for lifelong learning, all kinds of ideas. And then I asked them to do a open space process. Are you familiar with open space? So and then I had somebody, a graphic artist, take all those visions from the tables and create a collective vision for the neighborhood as a whole. So here's one for the central area of Seattle. Just taking common themes that they were hearing and putting it together into one. I did something similar in the Hayward neighborhood about 7 years ago. And then, you know what happens? We create this vision and then ask people about what small actions could you take that would move towards the vision. Asking people to think about what are the underutilized resources in the community and how could they use those to take actions, small steps that would move towards that vision. And then I asked people who were really passionate about some of those steps to stand. So you know what happens usually? People come up with ideas, right? And we have a workshop and we put them up on butcher paper, right? And then everybody puts their dots on their favorite ideas. Have you done that? Right? And then we tabulate the number of dots, and we put it in a planning document, and we put it in a file, and we never see it again. Have you been there? We have so many of those processes that are just dead ends. What I love about open space is we're really clear. Nothing is going to happen unless you take responsibility. With the other process, we come up with all these ideas, and like nobody's taking responsibility for any of it, so it just sits there. So we say, look, if you're really passionate about these ideas, you want to create a community garden, you need to stand up and say, I want to work on this. Who wants to join me? You know, I want to create a little free library. Who wants to join me? Right? I want to create a whatever it is. Who will join me? Vote with your feet. Go where your passion is. And oftentimes I do the visioning and the open space all as one exercise. Do it in one evening. I was going to try to do it in an hour tonight, but I lost the hour. But it really works. Out of the senior gatherings, here's some of what happened. The seniors came together and said, let's create a neighborhood walking map. A lot of us have been walking, and we know some cool routes that are very accessible. Let's put together a walking map to encourage other seniors to do walking. So they did that. Another said, let's create a one-stop lifelong learning website. There's lots of opportunities for lifelong learning at the University of Washington, through the public schools, through senior generation program. Let's put those on one website so they're accessible to people. Another one came up with an idea for a senior dating service. You know, clearly an unmet need in the community and something senior services wasn't addressing. Planning for senior co-housing. 3 virtual retirement villages. Are you familiar with those? Virtual villages? But the idea is to help support seniors to stay in their homes, in the neighborhood, so they can stay part of the community. So it's identifying what are their needs that people in the community can help support them, maybe helping maintain their yard, maybe helping to get groceries from the local store, just providing friendship. And then supplemented with sort of access to services that can't be provided by members of the community. But those virtual villages are taking off all over the place. 5 time banks came out of this. We had one gathering for the gay lesbian community, and they came up with a number of projects. That dance party I showed earlier from Columbia City, that came out of this process. So it's something to think about when you go back to your neighborhood. It's a great way to start connecting with the different networks. That's what we did in Columbia City where I lived. We just said we want to turn around the business district. Let's have a visioning session about how to make this business district work. We thought, what are all the key networks? Well, there was a German Lutheran church in the corner. There was an African American Baptist church. There was a synagogue. There was a historical society. There was a youth group. And we brought them all together to jointly plan for this visioning session. And then they all brought their networks together, and we sat together and created a vision for our neighborhood business district as a revitalized place. And that's where we got the murals. That's where we got the bicycle repair shop. That's where we got the farmer's market. All came out of that visioning open space process. So I'd really encourage you to think about this as a potential next step in your neighborhood. Woo! Yeah. So that's kind of what I put together. We'll have to get questions. Yeah.